Tilda chapter 1 greater than, they wouldn't dare, lasked my boss, Russell, McGee, Buffalino, to let me call Jimmy at his mobage by the lake. I was on a peace mission. All I was trying to do at that particular time was keep this thing from happening to Jimmy. I reached out for Jimmy on Sunday afternoon, July 27, 1975. Jimmy was gone by Wednesday, July 30th. Sadly, as we say, gone to Australia, down under. I will miss my friend until the day I join him. I was at my own apartment in Philly using my own phone when I made the long-distance call to Jimmy's cottage at Lake Orion near Detroit. If I had been in on the thing on Sunday, I would have used a pay phone, not my own phone. You don't survive as long as I did by making calls about important matters from your own phone. I wasn't made with a finger. My father used the real thing to get my mother pregnant. While I was in my kitchen standing by my rotary wall phone getting ready to dial the number I knew by heart, I gave some consideration to just how I was going to approach Jimmy. I learned during my years of union negotiations that it always was best to review things in your mind first before you opened your mouth. And besides that, this call was not going to be an easy one. When he got out of jail on a presidential pardon by Nixon in 1971, and he began fighting to reclaim the presidency of the Teamsters, Jimmy became very hard to talk to. Sometimes you see that with guys when they first get out. Jimmy became reckless with his tongue, on the radio, in the papers, on television. Every time he opened his mouth he said something about how he was going to expose the mob and get the mob out of the union. He even said he was going to keep the mob from using the pension fund. I can't imagine certain people liked hearing that their golden goose would be killed if he got back in. All this coming from Jimmy was hypocritical to say the least. Considering Jimmy was the one who brought the so-called mob into the union and the pension fund in the first place. Jimmy brought me into the union through Russell. With very good reason I was concerned for my friend more than a little bit. I started getting concerned about 9 months before this telephone call that Russell was letting me make. Jimmy had flown out to Philly to be the featured speaker at Frank Sheeran Appreciation Night at the Latin Casino. There were 3,000 of my good friends and family, including the mayor, the district attorney, guys I fought in the war with, the singer Jerry Vale and the gold digger dancers with legs that didn't quit, and certain other guests the FBI would call La Cosa Nostra. Jimmy presented me with a gold watch encircled with diamonds. Jimmy looked at the guests on the dais and said, "I never realized you were that strong." That was a special comment because Jimmy Hoffa was one of the 2 greatest men I ever met. Before they brought the dinner of prime rib, and when we were getting our pictures taken, some little nobody that Jimmy was in jail with asked Jimmy for 10 grand for a business venture. Jimmy reached in his pocket and gave him $2,500. That was Jimmy, a soft touch. Naturally, Russell Buffalino was there. He was the other one of the 2 greatest men that I ever met. Jerry Vale sang Russ's favorite song, Spanish Eyes, for him. Russell was boss of the Buffalino family of upstate Pennsylvania, and large parts of New York, New Jersey, and Florida. Being headquartered outside New York City, Russell wasn't in the inner circle of New York's 5 families, but all the families came to him for advice on everything. If there was any important matter that needed taking care of, they gave the job to Russell. He was respected throughout the country. When Albert Anastasia got shot in the barber's chair in New York, they made Russell the acting head of that family until they could straighten everything out. There's no way to get more respect than Russell got. He was very strong. The public never heard of him, but the families and the feds knew how strong he was. Russell presented me with a gold ring that he had made up special for just 3 people, himself, his underboss, and me. It had a big $3 gold piece on top surrounded by diamonds. Russ was big in the jewelry fencing and cat burglar world. He was a silent partner in a number of jewelry stores on Jewelers Row in New York City. The gold watch Jimmy gave me is still on my wrist, and the gold ring Russell gave me is still on my finger here at the assisted living home. On my other hand, I've got a ring with each of my daughter's birthstones. Jimmy and Russell were very much alike. They were solid muscle from head to toe. They were both short, even for those days. Russ was about 5 feet 8 inches. Jimmy was down around 5 feet 5 inches. In those days I used to be 6 feet 4 inches, and I had to bend down to them for private talks. They were very smart from head to toe. They had mental toughness and physical toughness. But in one important way they were different. Russ was very low-key and quiet, soft-spoken even when he got mad. Jimmy exploded every day just to keep his temper in shape, and he loved publicity. The night before my testimonial dinner, Russ and I had a sit-down with Jimmy. We sat at a table at Broadway Eddie's, and Russell Buffalino told Jimmy Hoffa flat out he should stop running for union president. He told him certain people were very happy with Frank Fitzsimmons, who replaced Jimmy when he went to jail. Nobody at the table said so, but we all knew these certain people were very happy with the big and easy loans they could get out of the Teamsters pension fund under the weak-minded Fitz. They got loans under Jimmy when he was in, and Jimmy got his points under the table, but the loans were always on Jimmy's terms. Fitz bent over for these certain people. All Fitz cared about was drinking and golfing. I don't have to tell you how much juice comes out of $1 billion pension fund. Russell said, "What are you running for? You don't need the money." Jimmy said, "It's not about the money. I'm not letting Fitz have the union." After the sit-down, when I was getting ready to take Jimmy back to the Warwick Hotel, Russ took me aside and said, "Talk to your friend. Tell him what it is." In our way of speaking, even though it doesn't sound like much, that was as good as a death threat. At the Warwick Hotel I told Jimmy if he didn't change his mind about taking back the union he had better keep some bodies around him for protection. I'm not going that route or they'll go after my family. Still in all, you don't want to be out on the street by yourself. Nobody scares Hoffa. I'm going after Fitz, and I'm going to win this election. You know what this means, I said. Russ himself told me to tell you what it is. They wouldn't dare, Jimmy Hoffa growled, his eyes glaring at mine. All Jimmy did the rest of the night and at breakfast the next morning was talk a lot of distorted talk. Looking back it could have been nervous talk, but I never knew Jimmy to show fear. Although one of the items on the agenda that Russell had spoken to Jimmy about at the table at Broadway Eddie's the night before my testimonial dinner was more than enough to make the bravest man show fear. And there I was in my kitchen in Philadelphia 9 months after Frank Sheeran Appreciation Night with the phone in my hand and Jimmy on the other end of the line at his cottage in Lake Orion, and me hoping this time Jimmy would reconsider taking back the union while he still had the time. My friend and I are driving out for the wedding, I said. I figured you and your friend would attend the wedding, Jimmy said. Jimmy knew, my friend, was Russell and that you didn't use his name over the phone. The wedding was Bill Buffalino's daughter's wedding in Detroit. Bill was no relation to Russell, but Russell gave him permission to say they were cousins. It helped Bill's career. He was the Teamsters lawyer in Detroit. Bill Buffalino had a mansion in Grosse Pointe that had a waterfall in the basement. There was a little bridge you walked over that separated one side of the basement from the other. The men had their own side so they could talk. The women stayed on their side of the waterfall. Evidently, these were not women who paid attention to the words when they heard Helen Reddy sing her popular song of the day, "I Am Woman, Hear Me Roar." I guess you're not going to the wedding, I said. Joe doesn't want people staring, he said. Jimmy didn't have to explain. There was talk about an FBI wiretap that was coming out. Certain parties were on the tape talking about extramarital relations his wife, Josephine, allegedly had years ago with Tony Cimini, a soldier in the Detroit outfit. Nobody believed that bull, Jimmy. I figured you wouldn't go because of this other thing. Fuck them. They think they can scare Hoffa. There's widespread concern that things are getting out of hand. I got ways to protect myself. I got records put away. Please, Jimmy, even my friend is concerned. How's your friend doing? Jimmy laughed. I'm glad he got that problem handled last week. Jimmy was referring to an extortion trial Russ had just beat in Buffalo. Our friend's doing real good, I said. He's the one gave me the go-ahead to call you. These respected men were both my friends, and they were both good friends to each other. Russell introduced me to Jimmy in the first place back in the 50s. At the time I had 3 daughters to support. I had lost my job driving a meat truck for food fare, when they caught me trying to be a partner in their business. I was stealing sides of beef and chickens and selling them to restaurants. So I started taking day jobs out of the Teamsters Union Hall, driving trucks for companies when their regular driver was out sick or something. I also taught ballroom dancing, and on Friday and Saturday nights I was a bouncer at the Nixon Ballroom, a black nightclub. On the side I handled certain matters for Russ, never for money, but as a show of respect. I wasn't a hitman for hire. Some cowboy. You ran a little errand. You did a favor. You got a little favor back if you ever needed it. I had seen on the waterfront in the movies, and I thought I was at least as bad as that Marlon Brando. I said to Russ that I wanted to get into union work. We were at a bar in South Philly. He had arranged for a call from Jimmy Hoffa in Detroit and put me on the line with him. The first words Jimmy ever spoke to me were, "I heard you paint houses. The paint is the blood that supposedly gets on the wall or the floor when you shoot somebody." I told Jimmy, "I do my own carpentry work, too. That refers to making coffins and means you get rid of the bodies yourself." After that conversation Jimmy put me to work for the International, making more money than I had made on all those other jobs put together, including the stealing. I got extra money for expenses. On the side I handled certain matters for Jimmy the way I did for Russell. So, he gave you the go-ahead to call. You should call more often. Jimmy was going to act nonchalant about it. He was going to make me get to the reason Russell granted me permission to call him. You used to call all the time. That's the whole thing I'm trying to say. If I called you, then what am I supposed to do? I got to tell the old man, what? That you're still not listening to him. He's not used to people not listening to him. The old man will live forever. No doubt, he'll dance on our graves, I said. The old man is very careful what he eats. He does the cooking. He won't let me fry eggs and sausage because one time I tried to use butter instead of olive oil. Butter. I wouldn't let you fry eggs and sausage either. And you know, Jimmy, the old man is very careful how much he eats. He always says you got to share the pie. You eat the whole pie you get the bellyache. I got nothing but respect for your friend, Jimmy said. I would never hurt him. There are certain elements Hoffa will get for fucking me out of the union, but Hoffa will never hurt your friend. I know that, Jimmy, and he respects you. Coming up from nothing, the way you did. All the good things you've done for the rank and file. He's for the underdog, too. You know that. You tell him for me. I want to make sure he never forgets. I've got nothing but respect for McGee. Only a handful of people referred to Russell as McGee. His real name was Rosario, but everybody called him Russell. Those who knew him better called him Russ. Those who knew him best called him McGee. Like I say, Jimmy, the respect is mutual. They say it's going to be a big wedding, Jimmy said. Italians are coming from all over the country. Yeah, that's good for us. Jimmy, I had a talk with our friend about trying to work this thing out. The timing is good. Everybody being there for the wedding. He was being very encouraging about the matter. Did the old man suggest working this out or did you? Jimmy asked quickly. I put the subject on the agenda, but our friend was very receptive. What did he say about this? Our friend was very receptive. He said let's sit down with Jimmy at the lake after the wedding. Work this thing out. He's good people. That's what McGee is. Come out to the lake, huh? Jimmy's tone of voice sounded as if he were on the verge of showing his famous temper but maybe in a good way. Hoffa always wanted to work this fucking thing out, from day one. More and more these days Jimmy was calling himself Hoffa. This is a perfect time to work it out with all the concerned parties in town for the wedding and all, I said. Settle the thing. From day one Hoffa wanted to work this fucking thing out, he hollered just in case everybody in Lake Orion didn't hear him the first time. Jimmy, I know you know this matter's got to be settled, I said. It can't go on like this. I know you're doing a lot of puffing about exposing this and exposing that. I know you're not serious. Jimmy Hoffa's no rat and he never will be a rat, but there is concern. People don't know how you puff. The hell Hoffa's not serious. Wait till Hoffa gets back in and gets his hands on the union records, we'll see if, puffing. From growing up around my old man and from union work, I think I know how to read the tone of people's voices. Jimmy sounded like he was on the verge of showing his famous temper back the other way again. Like I was losing him by bringing up the puffing. Jimmy was a born union negotiator, and here he was coming from strength, talking about exposing records again. Look at that matter last month, Jimmy. That gentleman in Chicago. I'm quite certain everybody thought he was untouchable, including himself. Irresponsible talk that could have hurt certain important friends of ours was his problem. Jimmy knew, the gentleman I was talking about was his good friend Sam, Momo, Giancana, the Chicago boss who just got killed. Many times I brought notes, verbal messages, nothing ever in writing, back and forth between Momo and Jimmy. Before he got taken care of, Giancana had been very big in certain circles and very big in the media. Momo had spread out from Chicago and moved into Dallas. Jack Ruby was a part of Momo's outfit. Momo had casinos in Havana. Momo opened a casino with Frank Sinatra in Lake Tahoe. He dated one of the singing McGuire sisters, the ones who sang on Arthur Godfrey. He shared a mistress with John F. Kennedy, Judith Campbell. This was while JFK was president and he and his brother Bobby were using the White House for their own motel room. Momo helped get JFK elected. Only Kennedy then stabbed Momo in the back. He paid him back by letting Bobby go after everybody. The way it went with Giancana is that the week before he got hit, Time magazine brought out that Russell Buffalino and Sam, Momo, Giancana had worked on behalf of the CIA in 1961 in the Bay of Pigs invasion of Cuba and in 1962 in a plot to kill Castro. If there was one thing that drove Russell Buffalino nuts, it was to see his name in print. The U.S. Senate had subpoenaed Giancana to testify about the CIA hiring the mob to assassinate Castro. 4 days before his appearance, Giancana was taken care of in his kitchen in the back of the head and then under the chin 6 times, Sicilian style, to signify he was careless with his mouth. It looked like it was done by some old friend that was close enough to him to be frying sausages in olive oil with him. Russell often said to me, "When in doubt, have no doubt." Our Chicago friend could have hurt a lot of people, even you and me, Jimmy yelled. I put the phone away from my ear and still could hear him. He should have kept records. Castro. Dallas. The gentleman from Chicago never put anything in writing. They know Hoffa keeps records. Anything unnatural happens to me, the records come out. I'm no yes man, Jimmy. So please don't tell me, they wouldn't dare. After what happened to our friend in Chicago, you gotta know by now what it is. You just be concerned for yourself, my Irish friend. You're too close to me in some people's eyes. You remember what I told you. Watch your own ass. Get some people around yourself. Jimmy, you know it's time to sit down. The old man is making the offer to help. I agree with that part of it. Jimmy was being the union negotiator, conceding just a little bit. Good. I jumped on that little bit. We'll drive out to the lake on Saturday around 12:30. Tell Joe not to fuss, we'll leave the women at a diner. T'll be ready at 12:30, Jimmy said. I knew he'd be ready at 12:30. Russ and Jimmy both went by time. You didn't show time, you didn't show respect. Jimmy would give you 15 minutes. After that you lost your appointment. No matter how big you were or thought you were. Tur'll have an Irish banquet waiting for you, a bottle of Guinness and a bologna sandwich. One more thing, Jimmy said. Just the two of you. Jimmy wasn't asking. He was telling. Not the little guy. I can relate to that part. You don't want the little guy. Want the little guy. Last I knew, Jimmy wanted the little guy dead. The little guy was Tony Provenzano, a made man and a captain in the Genovese family in Brooklyn. Pro used to be a Hoffa man, but he became the leader of the Teamsters faction that was against Jimmy taking back the Union. The bad blood that Pro had with Jimmy began with a beef they had in prison where they almost came to blows in the dining hall. Jimmy refused to help Pro go around the federal law and get his $1.2 million pension when he went to jail, while Jimmy got his $1.7 million pension even though he went to jail, too. A couple of years after they both got out, they had a sit-down at a Teamsters convention in Miami to try to square the beef. Only Tony Pro threatened to rip Jimmy's guts out with his bare hands and kill his grandchildren. At the time, Jimmy told me he was going to ask Russell for permission for me to take care of the little guy. Since Pro was a made man, a captain even, you didn't take care of Pro without getting approval from Russell. But then I never heard a peep. So I figured it was a fleeting thought during one of Jimmy's tempers. If anybody was serious, I'd hear about it the day they wanted me to do it. That's the way it's done. You get about a day's notice when they want you to take care of a matter. Tony Pro ran a Teamsters local in North Jersey where The Sopranos are on TV. I liked his brothers. Nuns and Sammy were good people. I never cared for Pro himself. He'd kill you for nothing. One time he had a guy kissed for getting more votes than him. They were on the same side of the ticket. Pro was at the head of the ticket, running for president of his local, and this poor guy was below him, running for some lesser office, I forget what. When Tony Pro saw how popular the guy was compared to him, Pro had Sally Bugs and an ex-boxer with the Jewish mob, K.O. Königsberg, strangle him with a nylon rope. That was a bad hit. When they made deals with the devil trying to nail the handful of us Hoffa suspects on any charge they could get, they got a rat to testify against Pro. They wound up giving Pro life for that bad hit. Pro died in jail. I won't meet with the little guy, Jimmy said, fuck the little guy. You're making me work hard here, Jimmy. I'm not trying to go for the Nobel Peace Prize here. Help Hoffa square this beef and I'll give you a peace prize. Remember, just the three of us. Take care. I had to be content that at least the three of us were going to sit down by the lake on Saturday. Jimmy sitting down with Russ and Frank, with our names on that yellow pad he kept near his phone for anybody to find. The next morning was Monday the 28th. My second wife, Irene, the mother of the youngest of my 4 daughters, Connie, was on her own line with her girlfriend. They were trying to decide what Irene should pack for the wedding when my line rang. It's Jimmy, Irene said. The FBI has a record of all these long-distance calls back and forth. But I don't think Jimmy had these kinds of records on his mind when he made his threats about exposing this and that. People couldn't tolerate threats like that very long. Even if you don't mean them yourself, you send the wrong message to the people at the bottom of the chain of command. How strong are the leaders if they tolerate people talking about ratting? When are you and your friend getting in? Jimmy said. Tuesday. That's tomorrow. Yeah, tomorrow night around dinner time. Good. Call me when you get in. Why wouldn't I? Whenever I got into Detroit, I would call the man out of respect. I've got a meeting set up on Wednesday afternoon, Jimmy said. He paused. With the little guy. Which little guy? That little guy. You don't mind me asking what changed your mind about meeting with that individual? My head was spinning. What have I got to lose? Jimmy said. McGee would expect Hoffa to try to square his own beef first. I don't mind making one last try before you come out to the lake on Saturday. I gotta urge you to take along your little brother. He knew what I meant. A gun, a piece, not the peace prize, a peacemaker. Precautionary. Don't you worry about Hoffa. Hoffa doesn't need a little brother. Tony Jack set the meet up. We'll be at a restaurant out in the public. The Red Fox on Telegraph, you know the place. Take care. Anthony, Tony Jack, Giacalone was with the Detroit outfit. Tony Jack was very close to Jimmy and his wife and kids. But Jimmy wasn't the only one in the picture that Tony Jack was close to. Tony Jack's wife was a first cousin to the little guy, Tony Pro. That's serious with the Italians. I could understand why Jimmy would trust Tony Jack. Tony Jack was very good people. He died in jail in February 2001. The headline read, Reputed U.S. Mobster takes Hoffa secret to grave. He could have told some things. Word was out for a long time that Tony Jack had been trying to arrange another sit-down between Jimmy and Tony Pro after the fiasco in Miami, but Jimmy went thumbs down on that idea like Siskel and Ebert. Now all of a sudden Jimmy was agreeing to meet with Pro, the same Pro that threatened to rip his guts out with his bare hands. Looking back, you know, hindsight and all, maybe Jimmy was the one setting Pro up to go to Australia. Maybe Jimmy was counting on Pro to act like Pro. Tony Jack would sit there at the restaurant and watch Jimmy being reasonable and Pro being an asshole. Maybe Jimmy wanted Russell to know on Saturday by the lake that he had tried everything humanly possible with the man, but now Pro had to go out in a public restaurant. That's good. Maybe this wedding really is bringing everybody together, I said. Smoking the peace pipe and burying old hatchets. Only, d'ye have more comfort if I was there for backup. All right, Irishman, he said, as if he was trying to make me feel better, even though he's the one that asked me when I was getting in to Detroit in the first place. As soon as he asked me when I was getting in, I knew what he wanted. How about you take a little ride and meet me there on Wednesday at 2 o'clock? They're coming at 2:30. Precautionary. But however, you can rest assured, I'll bring my little brother. He's a real good negotiator. I called Russ right away and told him the encouraging news about Jimmy's meeting with Jack and Pro, and that I was going to be with Jimmy for backup. I've thought a lot about it since, but I can't recall Russell saying what it is. My wife, Irene, and I got to Kingston in upstate Pennsylvania near Wilkes-Barre that Monday night. Our plan was to have dinner with Russ and his wife, Carrie, and her older widowed sister, Mary. Irene and I would spend the night at the Howard Johnson that Russ owned a piece of. Then early Tuesday the five of us would start off for Detroit in my new black Lincoln Continental. It was a car they said I got under the table. When they were trying to get the 8 of us Hoffa suspects on anything they could, they used the car to send me to jail in 1981 on labor racketeering. The drive would take us about 12 hours because Russell didn't allow smoking in the car. Russ quit smoking on a bet with Jimmy Blue Eyes, who was with Meyer Lansky, on a boat they took out of Cuba in 1960 when Castro kicked them all out and took away their casinos. They lost $1 million a day on account of Castro. They were all mad as hell at Castro, especially Russell and his 2 very close friends, Carlos Marcello, the New Orleans boss, and Santo Trafficante, the Florida boss. Castro had the nerve to actually put Trafficante in jail. I heard that Sam, Momo, Giancana had to send Jack Ruby to Cuba to spread some green stamps around to get Trafficante out of jail and out of Cuba. Being so fuming mad, Russell smoked cigarette after cigarette and softly cursed Castro on that boat. So Jimmy Blue Eyes saw an opportunity to bet Russ 25 gigaseconds Russ couldn't go a year without smoking. Russ threw his cigarette overboard and never picked up a cigarette again, even a year later after the bet was over and Jimmy Blue Eyes had paid up. But the ladies in the car made no such bet with anybody. We'd be stopping along the way for their smoke breaks, and that would slow us down. Smoking is one vice I never had to confess to the priest when I was a kid. I never got started on tobacco, not even in the war, not even pinned down at Onzio with nothing else to do in a dugout for 4 months but play cards, pray to God, and smoke. You need your wind in this life. Another reason it would take so long is that Russell always had business stops to make along the way whenever or wherever we went together. Instructions to give about certain matters, cash to pick up, stuff like that. On Monday night Irene and I had dinner with Russell, Carrie, and her sister Mary at Brutito's in Old Forge, Pennsylvania. Russ had special restaurants that met his standards. Otherwise, if he didn't cook it himself, most of the time he didn't eat it. If it weren't for Russ's gray hair there's no way you would know he was in his 70s. He was very spry. He was born in Sicily, but he spoke perfect English. He and Carrie never had any children. Many a time Russ reached up and pinched my cheek and said, "You should have been Italian." He's the one named me, the Irishman. Before that they used to call me, Cheech, which is short for Frank in Italian. Francesco. After we had our meal, which was something like veal and peppers with spaghetti marinara, a side dish of broccoli rabe, and a nice salad with dressing Russell made in the back, we sat and relaxed with our coffee laced with sambuca. Then the owner came over and whispered to Russ. This was before portable phones. Russ had to leave the table to take the call. He came back business-like. He had that smile on his round, craggy face you get when you squint at the sun. He had muscle deterioration in his face that gave him a lazy eye. If you didn't know him you would think he was blinking or drinking. With his good eye he looked through his wide glasses into my blue eyes. Russell didn't say anything at first, like he was trying to think how to say it by studying my eyes. Russell had a voice that crackled like a rattle, but the madder he got the softer Russell talked. He was very soft-spoken that night before my testimonial dinner at Frank Sheeran Appreciation Night when he warned Jimmy to back off from trying to take back the union. At the table at Brutitos, Russell was talking so soft I had to lean my extra-large head real close. In a raspy whisper he said, "We got a little change in plans. We're not leaving tomorrow. We stay put till Wednesday morning." The news hit me like a mortar shell. They didn't want me in Detroit Wednesday afternoon at that restaurant. They wanted Jimmy alone. I stayed bent over close to Russell. Maybe he'd tell me more. You listen. You don't ask questions. It seemed like it took him a good while. Maybe it just seemed like a long delay to me before he spoke. Your friend was too late. There's no need for you and me to meet him on Saturday by the lake. Russell Buffalino's penetrating good eye stayed on mine. I moved back up in my seat. I couldn't show anything in my face. I couldn't say a word. That's not the way it works. The wrong look in my eyes and my house gets painted. Jimmy warned me to watch myself back in October at the Warwick Hotel in Philly when I tried to tell him what it is. He said, "Watch your ass, you could end up being fair game." Just yesterday he got done warning me again on the phone that I was too close to him, in some people's eyes. I put the coffee and sambuca up to my nose. The licorice didn't smell strong enough against the smell of the coffee, so I added some sambuca. I didn't have to be told that I better not even think about calling Jimmy when Irene and I got back to the Howard Johnson Motel for the night. From this point on, whether it was true or not, I would have to assume that I was being watched. Russell had a piece of that Howard Johnson's. If I used the phone that night, it is quite likely that Irene and I never would have made it out of the parking lot the next morning. I would have gotten what some people thought was coming to me anyway, and poor Irene just would have been in the wrong place at the wrong time with the wrong Irishman. And there was no way in the world Jimmy could call me. In case the feds were listening, you never said on the phone where you'd be staying when you got to where you were going. There were no cell phones then. Jimmy just wouldn't get a call from me Tuesday night in Detroit, and that would be that. He would never know why. He'd go alone to his meeting on Wednesday. My little brother and I wouldn't be there for backup. I sat there in silence with the ladies talking among themselves. About who knows what. They might as well have been on the other side of the bridge over the waterfall in Bill Buffalino's basement. I was reviewing things fast. Right after I called Russell that morning about Jimmy calling me, Russell would have called certain important people. He would have told these people about me going to the restaurant with Jimmy and taking my little brother. Right or wrong, the best I could figure at that moment was that these people called Russell and told him they wanted us to stay put for a day so they could get Jimmy alone. Only before they called Russell they must have been reviewing things themselves. All day certain people in New York, Chicago, and Detroit must have been deciding whether or not to let me be there with Jimmy on Wednesday. That way one of the closest Hoffa supporters in America would go to Australia with Jimmy. Whatever secrets Jimmy may have told me after Broadway Eddies that night at the Warwick and over the years would die with me. In the end they made the decision to spare me out of respect for Russell. It wouldn't be the first time Russell saved me from something serious. I don't care how tough you are or how tough you think you are, if they want you, you're theirs. It's usually your best friend that walks up to you talking about a football bet and you're gone. Like Giancana got it frying eggs and sausages in olive oil with an old friend he trusted. This was the wrong time for me to sound like I was worrying about Jimmy. Still, I couldn't help myself. Without making it sound like I was trying to save Jimmy, I got right next to Russell's ear. The nuclear fallout from the feds. I tried not to stammer, but I probably was stammering. He was used to it, it was the way I talked since childhood. I wasn't worried that he might view it as some kind of sign that underscore I was having a problem with this particular matter because I was very loyal to Jimmy and very close to Jimmy and his family. I bowed my head and shook it from side to side. The nuclear fallout's going to hit the fan. You know, Jimmy's got records stashed away in case something unnatural happens to him. Your friend made one threat too many in his life, Russell shrugged. TM only saying the nuclear fallout's going to hit the fan when they find his body. There won't be a body. Russell went thumb down on the table with his right hand. Russell had lost the thumb and index finger on his left hand when he was young. He moved the thumb he still had around like he was grinding something into the white tablecloth and said, "Dust to dust." I leaned back and sipped my sambuca and coffee. "That's what it is," I said. I took another sip. "So, we get it on Wednesday night." The old man reached up and pinched my cheek like he knew what was in my heart. "My Irishman, we did all we could for the man. Nobody could tell that man what it is. We get into Detroit together Wednesday night." I put my coffee cup down into its saucer, and Russell moved his warm, thick hand to the back of my neck and left it there and whispered, "We'll drive so far, and we'll stop for the women someplace. We'll go do some business." "Sure," I thought, and nodded. Russell had business all along the route from Kingston to Detroit. We'd drop the women at some roadside diner and go do our business while they smoked and had coffee. Russell leaned toward me, and I bent down and leaned close to him. He whispered, "There'll be a pilot waiting. You take a quick fly over the lake and do a little errand in Detroit. Then you fly back. Pick the women up. They won't even notice we're gone. Then we take our time. Nice, leisurely drive the rest of say way to Detroit. The scenic route. We're in no hurry. That's what. Get yourself another punching bag." What were the twists and turns that brought me to that exact moment in a small Italian restaurant in a coal mining town in Pennsylvania, where I listened carefully to whispered orders. Orders I had to follow for the part one had to play in the plot against my friend Jimmy Hoffa. I wasn't born into that mafia way of life like the young Italians were, who came out of places like Brooklyn, Detroit, and Chicago. I was Irish Catholic from Philadelphia, and before I came home from the war one never did anything really wrong, not even a pinch for disorderly conduct. I was born into some rough times, not just for the Irish, but for everybody. They say the Depression started when I was 9 years old in 1929, but as far as I'm concerned our family never had any money. Nobody else's family did either. My first taste of enemy fire came from farmers in New Jersey when I was a young lad. Philadelphia sits across the wide Delaware River from Camden, New Jersey. Both cities got their start as ocean-going port towns and are connected by the Walt Whitman Bridge. It's hard to believe now, when you drive out past Camden and you see that there's hardly any free land for so much as a tiny Victory Garden, that in the roaring 20s when I was a kid it was all flat, fenced-in farmland. New Jersey was the sticks compared to Philadelphia. It was real peaceful out there. My father, Tom Sheeran, would borrow a big old clumsy car with a running board. He'd drive me out to the farm fields outside of Camden from the time I was very little. He'd drop me off where the Camden airport is now so I could do a little harvesting. We'd go in the early evening when it was still light enough to see. But getting dark. That's the time of day when the farmers were expecting to have their own dinner. I would climb over the farmer's fence and toss back to my father samples of the crop I was harvesting. It could be ears of corn or tomatoes or whatever was in season. That's what you had to do to get by and put food on the table. But the farmers weren't any too happy with our ideas about sharing in nature's bounty. Some nights they'd be waiting for us with shotguns. Some farmer would chase me, and I'd jump over the fence and get hit in the butt with birdshot. One of my earliest childhood memories is getting birdshot picked out of my backside by my mother, Mary. My mother would say, "Tom, how come I'm always picking this stuff out of Francis's behind?" My father, who always called her Mame, would say, "Because the boy doesn't run fast enough, Mame." I get my size from my mother's Swedish side of the family. Her father was a miner and a railroad worker in Sweden. Her brother was a doctor in Philadelphia, Drive. Hansen. My mother was about 5 feet 1 and never weighed less than 200 pounds. She ate a quart of ice cream every day. I used to go down to the ice cream parlor for her every night. You would bring your own bowl and they would give you so many dips of ice cream. They knew to expect me. My mother loved to cook and make all her own bread. I can still smell the aroma of her roast pork, sauerkraut, and potatoes simmering on the coal stove. My mother was a very quiet woman. I think she showed her love for us through her cooking. My folks got married very late in life for those days. My mother was 42 when they had me, their first kid, and my father was 43. They had us a year apart. My brother was 13 months younger than me, and my sister was 13 months younger than him. We were what they used to call Irish twins because the Catholic Irish popped those babies out so close together. Even though my mother was Swedish, my father raised us Irish. His people were from outside of Dublin, and I never met any of my grandparents on either side. People in those days didn't display affection like they do today. I'm still learning how to be affectionate to my grandchildren. I don't ever remember getting a kiss from my mother. I never even saw her kiss my kid brother, or my kid sister, Margaret. Not that anyone meant to play favorites, but Tom was my father's favorite and Peggy was my mother's. I guess I was so big, and being the oldest, they expected me to be more grown up than the two younger ones. I even got that in school from teachers who talked to me like I was an older kid and expected me to understand what they were talking about. My folks did the best they could with what they had. Every Easter, Tom and Peggy would get some new clothing to wear, but my parents would never have any money to get me anything. Getting a new outfit for Easter was big in the Catholic neighborhoods I grew up in. I can remember one Easter when I complained to my father about never getting anything for Easter and he told me, "Take Tom's new hat and put it on your head and stand in front of the window and the neighbors will think you got a new hat, too." I can't remember any of us Sheeran kids ever having a toy of our own. One Christmas we got a pair of roller skates to share. They were metal skates, and you could adjust the size. We learned to go without. And if we wanted something we had to fend for ourselves. I had my first job when I was 7, helping a guy clean out the ashes from cellars. And if I managed to get some work cutting somebody's grass for spending money and my father found out about it, he'd wait up the block until I got paid, and then he'd come down and take the big coins and leave me maybe a dime. We lived in a lot of different Catholic neighborhoods, but mostly in the same parish. We'd spend a few months somewhere, and then my father would get behind in the rent, and we'd sneak out in a hurry and move to another apartment. Then we'd do it again when that rent came due. When he got work, my father worked as a steel worker, high up on tall buildings, walking on beams like those Mohawk Indians. It was dangerous work. People were always falling to their death. He worked on the building of the Ben Franklin Bridge in Philadelphia and on the few high-rise buildings they could afford to build in the Depression. He was about 2 inches shorter than my mother, maybe 5 feet 8 inches, and weighed about 145 pounds. For a long time the only work my father could get was as the sexton and the school janitor at the Blessed Virgin Mary Church and School in Darby, Pennsylvania. The Catholic religion was an important part of our lives. It was mandatory. If I had to say what my mother's hobby was, I'd say she was very religious. I spent a lot of time inside Catholic churches. My father had studied for 5 years at a seminary to be a priest before he dropped out. His 2 sisters were nuns. I learned all about confession as a way to get absolution for your sins. If you died on your way to confession before you could tell the priest what you had done wrong, you would burn in hell for all eternity. If you died on your way home from confession after confessing your sins, you would go straight to heaven. I was an altar boy at Mother of Sorrows Church until I got kicked off for trying the sacramental wine. I don't blame the other altar boy who snitched on me. He wasn't really a rat. Father O'Malley, believe it or not, that was his name, just like the priest Bing Crosby always played, saw the wine was missing and told the boy that whoever took the wine wouldn't go to heaven. I guess the other kid figured he had a shot to go to heaven, so he squealed on me. And the worst part about it is I didn't even like the wine they used. My father did like his beer. My father used to bet on me a lot in the speakeasies. We'd be in a new section of Philadelphia where they didn't know us too well yet, and he'd go in a speakeasy and bet somebody that he had a 10-year-old kid who could lick any 14 or 15-year-old boy. He'd bet some kid's father a quarter for beer, and us kids would have to fight it out in front of all the grown men. If I won, which was almost always the case, he'd toss me a dime. If I lost, he'd cuff me hard on the back of the head. We lived for a while in a mostly Italian neighborhood, and I had to fight to get home from school every day. I learned a lot of Italian words as a kid that helped me later on in the Sicilian and Italian campaigns during the war. While I was over there I learned to speak Italian pretty good. While I was learning it, mostly to get along with the Italian women, I didn't realize that the people I would get involved with after the war would be very impressed with how well I spoke Italian. They took it as a sign of respect toward them. It made it a lot easier for them to confide in me and trust me and respect me. My father, Thomas Sheeran, was an amateur boxer for Shanahan's Catholic Club. He was a tough welterweight. Many years later after the war one would go on to play football for Shanahan's. When I was a kid a lot of our activities were supplied by the church. This was way before television. Very few people had radios and the movies cost precious money. So people came and watched the church events or participated in them. My father competed a lot in the ring. He also competed a lot at home. Whenever he thought Petey done something wrong, he'd toss me the boxing gloves. But I wasn't allowed to hit back. My father was untouchable. He would jab my face and throw hooks and overhand rights. Being a steel worker, he could hit. I would bob and weave and try to block the blows with my own gloves. If I was foolish enough to try to punch him, I'd really get hammered. I was the only one in the family he ever tossed the gloves to. No matter what Thomas Jr., who was named after him, did wrong, he never got cuffed around. But then Tom never played the pranks I did either. Nothing bad, but I was always a rebel. One time in the 7th grade, when I was attending the Blessed Virgin Mary Elementary School, I took Limburger cheese out of the old ice box tray at home and brought it to school. Schools were pretty cold when you first got there until the heat came up, and we all sat with our sweaters and jackets on in the winter. They had steam heat in the school. The heat came from radiators and we'd have to wait for them to warm up. I stuck the Limburger in the radiator. It heated up and got softer and softer and slowly stunk the whole room up. They called my father, who was the school janitor. He followed the smell and found the Limburger, and then some other kid ratted me out. My old man said he'd see me when he got home. When I got home and waited for him, I knew that as soon as he got home he was going to get the boxing gloves out and toss them to me. Sure enough, when he came through the door he calmly said, "What do you want to do, eat first or eat after I kick your ass?" I said, "I'll eat first." I knew I wouldn't feel like eating dinner afterward. I got it pretty good that night, but at least I got some food in me. I stammered a lot as a young fellow coming up, and I still do when I talk too fast, even today at 83. Stammering as a kid will get you in a lot of fights. Boys who didn't know how good I could fight would make fun of me, but they'd pay for it. We kids fought a lot for fun, too. Every Friday night we would have boxing matches on the corner. Nobody got hurt too bad. It was all for the sport of it, and that's how you learned how to fight, by getting your ass kicked once in a while. I thought about becoming a boxer, but I knew I could never be as good as Joe Louis, and if you couldn't be the champ, boxing was no life. Kids today play soccer and little league. I love to go to my grandchildren's soccer games. But back then we had to amuse ourselves, and fighting seemed to be all we had. Looking back, it was good for us. You got a lot out of your system. And you learned a lot. And then when our country needed soldiers we were in shape. We already had a mental toughness. I graduated from the 8th grade at Blessed Virgin Mary, where my father worked and where I had to watch my step. For high school I got switched to public school, which had a less restricted atmosphere. They enrolled me in the 9th grade at Darby High School. I didn't get very far in the 9th grade, though. One morning in assembly the principal was on the stage singing and leading us in the old song, "On the Road to Mandalay." He would emphasize by winking after each line of the song like some vaudeville singer. Being so tall I stood out and he could look right at me. So every time he would wink I would imitate him and wink back at him. When we got done with the assembly he told me to wait in his office for him. I went and sat there in the chair in front of his desk. He was a pretty big man, my height, only he outweighed me. He walked into the office, came up behind me, and cuffed me hard on the back of the head just the way my father used to whenever I lost one of his beer bets for him. "You fat fuck," I said and jumped up and decked him. I broke his jaw, and they expelled me permanently on the spot. Naturally, I knew what to expect when my father got home. I had a lot of time to think about it, but all I could think about was breaking the principal's jaw with just one punch, a grown man. My father walked in the door steaming mad and threw the boxing gloves at me hard. I caught them, but this time I threw them back at him. I said, "You better take another look." I was 16, almost 17, by then. "I won't hit you," I said. "You're my father. But you better get yourself another punchiga GI. Little Egypt University, and then I joined the carnival. The highlight of every spring in Philadelphia was the arrival of the Regent Traveling Carnival. They would set up their tents on 72nd Street near Island Avenue. There was absolutely nothing out there then but long stretches of grassland. It was just the way the Indians left it. Today it's wall-to-wall car dealerships. As big a city as it was and as close as it was to New York City, Philadelphia had a small-town feel to it. The Commonwealth of Pennsylvania had blue laws that didn't allow bars to be open on Sunday. No stores were open. It was the day of worship. Even later on, when night baseball came in, the Philadelphia Phillies and the Philadelphia Athletics could play baseball at Shibe Park on Sunday only while there was daylight. They weren't allowed to turn on the stadium lights on Sunday. Many a Sunday game was called on account of darkness. You never picked up a paper and read about Prohibition, gangland killings, or any of that stuff that went on in New York, just a couple of hours away on the Pennsylvania Railroad. So the carnival coming to Philadelphia was very big entertainment. After I got expelled from Darby High, I had been working at odd jobs, bagging groceries at Penn Fruit, and, depending on the weather, hitchhiking up to Paxson Hollow Golf Course to caddy. I was living at home, which still meant moving around a lot to beat the rent. Maybe all that moving around every time the rent came due gave me my restless streak, and that restless streak burst out like so many buds on a tree that spring when the carnival arrived. My best buddy at the time was Francis Yank Quinn. He was a year older than me and had finished high school. A few years later he went on to college and into the service as a second lieutenant. He saw plenty of combat in Europe. But I never ran into him over there. Later on after the war we played football together at Shanahan's Catholic Club. Yank was the quarterback. One warm night Yank and I, with $1 between us to spend but not a steady job between us, went to the carnival to look around, and the next thing you know we both had taken laborer jobs to travel with the show on their New England tour. All my young life I wanted to get out of Philadelphia and see the world, and now I was doing it and getting paid for it. I worked for the Barker in the girly show. Regent had 2 girly dancers, something like the old go-go dancers they came out with in the 70s. Only the carny dancers had more clothes on. They left a lot up to the imagination of the customers. The 2 girly dancers were Little Egypt, the brunette who dressed as if she had oozed out of an Aladdin's lamp, and Neptune of the Nile, the blonde who wore a series of blue veils as if she had bubbled up out of the deep blue sea. They worked one at a time and did their exotic dances on a stage inside their own tent. The Barker would promote the show, and I would collect 50 cents from the customers and give them their tickets. The Regent shows were pure variety entertainment, like the old Ed Sullivan Show on TV. They had jugglers, acrobats, games where people could win Kewpie dolls, a knife thrower, a sword swallower, and a band playing circus songs. There was no gambling going on. The customers didn't really have any money to gamble. It was the height of the Depression. No matter what they say, the Depression didn't end until the war came. And we laborers certainly didn't have any money to gamble. The laborers were mostly runaways and people without roots. Everybody was very decent, though, no troublemakers. Yank and I would help set up the tents and the seats for the customers and take it all down when we traveled on. If there was any trouble, maybe fighting going on among the customers, the local law would just tell us to pack up and leave town. If business was good and we were getting a good reception from the crowds, we'd stay about 10 days. Otherwise, if we weren't making any money, we would pack up and move on in search of a better reception. We played a lot of small towns in places like Connecticut, Vermont, New Hampshire, and outside of Boston. We moved around in run-down trucks and old beat-up cars, and we slept outdoors on blankets under the stars. This was no Ringling Brothers, it was a honky-tonk carnival. I guess you could say that my childhood of moving around with my family like nomads in the desert prepared me for the inconveniences of this life. They didn't pay us much, but they fed us and the food was good and solid. Lots of hearty beef stew that smelled wonderful in the outdoors. It couldn't touch my mother's cooking, but not much could. If it rained, we'd sleep under the trucks. I got my first taste of moonshine on the road with that carnival under a truck in the rain. I really didn't care for it. I actually didn't develop the drinking habit until during the war. I did my first real drinking in Catania, Sicily. The first time I tasted red wine, it became my drink of choice and stayed that way all my life. One morning at a stop on the road in Brattleboro, Vermont, the rain came pouring down and didn't let up all day. There was mud everywhere. And no customers, no 50 cents to collect, and no tickets to give out. Little Egypt saw me standing around breathing hot air into my hands trying to keep warm and took me aside and whispered in my ear. She asked me if I wanted to spend the night in her tent with her and Neptune. I knew they liked me and I said, yeah, sure. Yank would have to sleep under a truck, but I was going to be nice and dry for the night. After the show, I took my blankets and went to their dressing room, which smelled like perfume the second you walked in. Their dressing room was in a tent that they also slept in. Little Egypt was resting on her bed with pillows fluffed up behind her and she said, "Why don't you take your clothes off and get comfy? They must be wet." By this time I was 17. I hesitated a little bit, not sure if she was kidding, and she asked me, "Have you ever been with a woman?" And I told her the truth, which was, no. "Well, you're going to be with one tonight," Little Egypt said and laughed. She got up from the bed and lifted my shirt up over my head. I was standing there topless. "Make the two women," Neptune of the Nile chimed in from behind me, also laughing. Then she whistled at me. I must have turned red. And that was the night I lost my cherry. I had been stored up for years before then. I didn't believe in masturbation. The church was against it, but I was, too. There was something about it that I didn't think was right. After I had my first lovemaking session with Little Egypt in control, Neptune asked me to come over to her bed and Little Egypt gave me a little shove. When I got there, Neptune of the Nile asked me first to lick her. I stammered and said, "I waited long enough for this much, I can wait a little longer for that." In those days, believe it or not, oral sex on a woman was considered a sin and a scandal. At least in Philadelphia. When I got inside of Neptune of the Nile, she looked as if she was watching my face for a reaction. When she saw my eyes suddenly pop open real wide, Neptune said, "Get all of this while you can, young fellow, it'll make you a complete man." I've got a snapper. You won't see a snapper too often. And oh mother of mercy, did she ever. I thought I had muscles. All that night I made up for a lot of lost time, going from bed to bed with those two highly experienced grown women. Those two were wild women. I was young and strong then. The next morning I thought, how long has this been going on? What the hell have I been missing? Little Egypt and Neptune of the Nile gave me a college education in how to please a woman. There were no books in those days, and around the neighborhood you got your sex education from your bragging friends who knew less than you did. I spent a lot of nights in that tent, mostly with Little Egypt, falling asleep in her bed with her long brown hair all over us, smelling of perfume, and cuddling together. Poor Yank, sleeping out in the cold on the damp ground. I don't think he ever forgave me. Yank was a good man who lived a good life. He never did anything wrong. He died before his time, while I was still in jail. They wouldn't let me come home on a pass for his funeral. Not even for my brother's or sister's funerals. Yank managed O'Malley's restaurant on the Westchester Pike, and he wrote me in jail that he was going to throw a great big welcome home party for me when I got out, but poor Yank got a heart attack and it killed him. When we reached Maine with the carnival, the summer was mostly over. It was around September, and the Regent show always went south to Florida to spend the winter down there. We were in Camden, Maine, when the show closed. About 40 miles away there was a logging camp that we heard was doing some hiring, so off Yank and I went on a dirt road into the woods on foot. I knew I was going to miss Little Egypt, but there was no more work for me with the carnival once we tore down camp for the last time and got the trucks loaded. The logging company hired us both. They put Yank in the kitchen helping the cook. On account of my size they put me on a two-man saw. I was too young to fell the big trees, but I sawed the branches off the trees and turned them into logs once they were on the ground. Then bulldozers would push the logs into the river and they'd float downstream to a point where trucks would load them. Sawing those trees all day was hard work. I was only about 6 feet 1 inch then and weighed about 175 pounds, and after 9 months of that work there wasn't an ounce of fat on me. We slept in little shacks they had set up with pot-bellied wood-burning stoves and we ate, you guessed it, stew and more stew. After a day of sawing logs by hand you never tasted food so good. We saved what little money we made because there was no place to spend it. Neither Yank nor I played cards with the men or they'd have cleaned us out. They had a wild form of rugby they played on Sundays. I played a lot of that. I never did catch on to the rules, if there were any. It was just a lot of knocking each other down. It seemed like every night that it didn't snow we had boxing matches in a roped-off section that was like a ring. They didn't have any gloves up there, and so the fighters would wrap their fists in bandages. Everybody wanted to see the big kid fight the men who were in their late 20s and 30s, so by popular demand I participated a lot in those matches. It reminded me of my father pairing me up with older boys to win beer bets. Including my own father, it seemed like I was always matched against people older than me. Only these loggers could hit even harder than my father. I lost many a fight, but I could always hit, too, and I learned an awful lot of tricks. I think you're born with the ability to hit. Rocky Marciano didn't start boxing until after the war when he was already 26, but he was a natural hitter. You need leverage, but a lot of your power comes from your forearm down into your wrist. There's a snap to your punch that comes from your wrist to your fist, and that's what knocks the other guy out. You can actually hear that snap. It sounds like a pistol shot when it's working to perfection. Joe Louis had that famous 6-inch punch. He'd knock a guy out with a punch that only traveled 6 inches. His power came from the snap. It's like snapping a towel at somebody's butt. There's no power in your arms. Then if you learn a trick or two besides, you're set for life. They say Jack Dempsey learned all the tricks of fighting as a 13-year-old working in the mining camps of Colorado. I can believe that about Dempsey after my 9 months in the deep woods of Maine. We hitchhiked back to Philly that next summer, and all of a sudden we found we had a new interest besides boxing, chasing girls. I worked 2 or 3 jobs, whenever I could find work, until I got an apprenticeship at the Pearlstein Glass Company at 5th and Lombard. It was a commercial area then just off South Street. Now it's where the young kids go to shop. I was studying to be a glazier. I learned how to set windows in all the big buildings in town. Sometimes I worked in the shop grinding bevels on the glass. I learned a lot, and it was nowhere near as hard work as logging. At the end of a workday I still had plenty of energy left to compete against Yank for the neighborhood girls. My secret weapon against Yank was my dancing. Most big men are clumsy and heavy-footed, but not me. I had a good sense of rhythm and I could move every part of my body. I had very fast hands, too, and good coordination. Swing music was sweeping the country and social dancing was all the rage. I went dancing 6 nights a week, never on a Sunday, to a different hall every night. That's how you learned the dances. You learned by going dancing. They all had certain steps, unlike today where you just make it up as you go along. After the war, one of the jobs I had was a ballroom dance instructor. In 1939, when I was 19, my dance partner, Roseanne de Angelis, and I took second place in the foxtrot competition against 5,000 other couples in Madison Square Garden in the Harvest Moon Ball Dance Contest. Roseanne was some graceful dancer. I met her up at the garden before the contest when her partner got hurt on the dance floor during practice. My partner got tired and worn out, so Roseanne and I teamed up. The Harvest Moon was the biggest event in dancing in the whole country. It was sponsored every year by the New York Daily News. Many years later I taught my daughters how to dance, every kind of dance, even the tango and the rumba. I made good money at Pearlstein's, almost $45 a week. That was more than my father made at the Blessed Virgin Mary. Out of that money I paid room and board at home so we didn't have to keep moving. My sister, Peggy, was still in school and worked after school at the A&P as a stalker. My brother, Tom, was out of the house. He had dropped out of school and joined the CCC, a youth conservation corps that Roosevelt had set up to provide jobs for the youth on account of the Depression. The young men would go to camps set up in rural areas around the country, and they'd work on conservation projects. Most of the money I had left over from paying my parents out of my Pearlstein's pay was spent in the dance halls. There wasn't a lot left over to spend on dates with the girls, but Yank and I found ways to have fun without money. One afternoon I took a pretty young Irish girl with freckles buck bathing in the creek off Darby Road, where Mercy Fitzgerald Hospital is now. The creek was about 100 yards from the road. Yank snuck up on us and swiped our clothes. Then he stood up at the top of the hill near the road and yelled down for the girl I was with to come out of the water, get dressed, and go with him or he'd leave with her clothes, too. So she came out and went off with him and he gave a kid a quarter to hold onto my clothes until Yank and the girl got out of sight and then dropped them back down by the creek and run like hell. I'm sure I played a trick back on him. I just don't remember exactly which trick it was. Did I spread the rumor that a pregnant girl he didn't even know was his responsibility? Probably. Did I give him a hot foot? No doubt. But that's about all we did. Played jokes. Walked around and messed around. We were no longer boxers and fighters and road warriors, we were lovers and dancers. I had been to the Little Egypt University and the Neptune of the Nile Graduate School, and it was my duty to the young maidens of the city of brotherly love not to let all that good education go to waste. I had the ideal carefree young man's life, the life of Riley, popular with the girls, good pals, no responsibilities, a life where your only real job is to build memories for the rest of your days. Except I couldn't stay put. I was impatient. I had to move on. Pretty rapidly I found myself halfway around the world. But by then I no longer could have the luxury to be impatient. I had to do things the Army's way, hurry up and wait. 11 days EO pulling guard duty at Lowry Field for the Army Air Corps. Most people think it was Glenn Miller who first made that song famous, but it was a black bandleader named Erskine Hawkins. He wrote the song and had the first hit with it. That song stayed with me like a theme song through the whole war. After the war, one had my first date with Mary, my future wife, to see Erskine Hawkins at the Old Earl Theater in Philly. One cold night in December 1941 I won a dance contest jitterbugging to Tuxedo Junction, at the Denver Dance Hall. The next thing I knew I was on a troop train at 4 in the morning heading for the West Coast to defend California. The Japanese had bombed Pearl Harbor. I just turned 21 and I was 6 feet 2 inches. 4 years later when the war ended I got my discharge one day before I turned 25, I was 6 feet 4 inches. I had grown 2 inches. People forget how young we were. Some of us were not full grown yet. I spent the war as a rifleman in Europe in the Thunderbird Division, the 45th Infantry Division. They say the average number of days of actual combat for a veteran is around 80. By the time the war was over the Army told me I had 411 combat days, which entitled me to $20 extra pay a month. I was one of the lucky ones. The real heroes, some of them with only one combat day, are still over there. As big a target as I was in as many firefights as I was in, I never got hit by a German bullet or shrapnel. I said a lot of foxhole prayers, especially pinned down in a dugout in Anzio. And whatever anybody wants to say about my childhood, one TEEOE did teach me was how to take care of myself, how to, for so. Eliciting information from Frank Sheeran about his combat experiences was the most difficult part of the interview process. It was 2 years before he could accept the fact that his combat experience was even worth discussing. And then it became painstaking and stressful for both a respectful questioner and his reluctant subject, with many stops and starts. To help me understand his combat days, Sheeran tracked down the 45th Infantry Division's hardbound, 202-page official combat report, issued within months of World War II's end. The more I learned from both this report and Frank himself, the clearer it seemed to me that it was during his prolonged and unremitting combat duty that Frank Sheeran learned to kill in cold blood. The combat report states, the 45th paid heavily for maintaining our American heritage, 21,899 battle casualties. Considering that a fully staffed division has 15,000 members, Sheeran saw replacements march in and be carried out on a daily basis. The report asserts a record of 511 days of combat for the division itself, that is, 511 days of shooting and being shot at on the front lines. The Thunderbird Division fought valiantly from the very first day of the war in Europe to the very last. With time out for rest and rehabilitation along the way, Private Frank Sheeran, with 411 combat days, experienced more than 80% of the division's total days of combat. Sheeran was conditioned for the rest of his life by the experience of killing and maiming day after day, and wondering when he would be next. Not all people are affected the same way by the same events. We are each our own fingerprints and the sum of our own life's experiences. Other combat veterans I have interviewed drop their jaws and gasp at the thought of 411 days of combat. T ought to kick your ass, Charlie, Diggsy, Myers said. I was 2 years older than Diggsy and a foot taller. We had been pals since grade school. What did I do wrong? What do you want to kick my ass for, Diggs? I asked and smiled down at him. You had a non-combat gravy job in the MPs. You could have sat out the whole friggin' war in the States. You must be crazy transferring over here. I always knew you had a screw loose, but this takes the cake. You think we're having fun over here? I wanted to see some action, I said, already feeling like a jackass. Well, you'll see it. A blast like thunder and a loud, whistling buzz shot across the sky. What's that? That's your action. He handed me a shovel and said, here. What the hell is this for? I asked. Your foxhole. Start digging. Welcome to Sicily. After I got done digging, Charlie explained to me that an exploding shell is going to spread its shrapnel on an angle upward. You get down and stay down and let it sail over you. Otherwise it cuts you in half right across your chest. When we were kids I looked out for Diggsy, but now it was going to be the other way around. How did I end up with a shovel in my hand in Sicily in 1943? In August 1941 I had enlisted in the army. The rest of the world was already in the war, but we were neutral and weren't in it yet. Biloxi, Mississippi, was where I did my basic training. One day a Southern sergeant addressed the recruits and said he could lick any one of us and if anybody thought otherwise they should step forward now. I took a giant step forward, and he had me digging latrines for 5 days. It was just a trick to get us to respect his rank and rank in general. They were getting us ready for a war. After basic training, the army took one look at me and sized me up as a perfect specimen for the military police. They didn't ask you what you thought of your new assignment, and before the war started there was no way out of the MPs. But after Pearl Harbor, with a war going on, they let you transfer out of the military police if you were willing to go into combat. I liked the idea of dropping out of the sky and into combat, and I signed right up for the Army Airborne and transferred to Fort Benning, Georgia, for paratroop training. I was in real good shape, so the rigid training of a paratrooper came easy for me. I liked the whole idea of finally seeing some action. When your parachute landed, you'd be on your own a lot, kind of self-reliant. I thought I was something special until I jumped from a tower during training and dislocated my right shoulder. I had landed wrong, and they gave you only one mistake. They cut me from the team. I was now going to go into the infantry as a combat foot soldier. Meanwhile, no amount of authority or military discipline could stop me from getting into my little scrapes. I was in one scrape after another in my army career. I went into the army as a private, and I came out 4 years and 2 months later as a private. They gave me combat promotions from time to time, but then I'd have my fun and get busted back down. All in all I had 50 days lost under AWOL, absent without official leave, mostly spent drinking red wine and chasing Italian, French, and German women. However, I was never AWOL when my outfit was going back to the front lines. If you were AWOL when your company was going back into combat, you might as well keep going because your own officers would blow you away, and they didn't even have to say it was the Germans. That's desertion in the face of the enemy. While I was waiting to be shipped overseas, they had me at Camp Patrick Henry in Virginia, and I gave some lip back to one of those Southern sergeants, so they put me on KP kitchen patrol peeling potatoes. First chance I got, I bought some laxative at the PX and put it in the giant coffee urn. Everybody wound up with bad diarrhea, including the officers. Unfortunately, I was the only one who didn't report in sick at the infirmary. They had that caper solved before they put in a requisition for extra toilet paper. Can you guess which brilliant criminal ended up on his knees scrubbing bathroom floors? I set sail on July 14, 1943, for Casablanca in North Africa, assigned to the 45th Infantry Division as an infantry rifleman. While you couldn't choose your division, you could choose a particular company in the division if they had an opening. A company is about 120 men. Our church in Philly put out a newsletter keeping tabs on where all the neighborhood boys were stationed, so I knew Diggsy was with the Thunderbird. I asked to be in his company and got it. That didn't mean I'd end up in his platoon of about 32 men or end up in his 8-man squad in his platoon, but I did, and we stayed together in the same squad, in the fall of 1942, while they were still being trained for combat in the States and had yet to go overseas, General George S. Patton addressed Diggsy and the men of the 45th from the stage of a theater in Fort Devens, Massachusetts. General Patton told the impressionable boys of the 45th, boys away from home for the first time, about to be sent overseas to fight and die, that he had a special role in the war for their division. As reported by Colonel George E. Martin, Chief of Staff to the commanding officer of the 45th Infantry Division, General Patton had much to say, all interlarded with shockingly coarse and profane language. He was telling of occurrences when British infantry moving forward to attack would bypass enemy pockets, only to find themselves engaged by this enemy to the rear. Then when the British turned to mop up, the German soldiers would fling down their weapons and raise their hands in surrender. If this should happen to us, said General Patton, we should not accept their surrender, instead we should kill every last one of the bastardly SOBs. We were then told that our division probably would see more combat than any other American division, and he wanted us to be known to the Germans as the Killer Division. In a follow-up speech on June 27 in Algiers, North Africa, as reported by an officer of the division who was present, Patton told the men of his Killer Division to kill and to continue to kill, and that the more we killed the less we'd have to kill later and the better off the division would be in the long run. He did say that the more prisoners we took, the more men we would have to feed and not to fool around with prisoners. He said that there was only one good German and that was a dead one. Another officer listening to the speech reported Patton's position on the killing of civilians. He said something about if the people living in the cities persisted in staying in the vicinity of the battle and were enemy, we were to ruthlessly kill them and get them out of the way. At my foxhole dug, Diggsy told me there were two big scandals going on. Everybody hated snipers. Both sides hated snipers, and if you captured one it was okay to kill him on the spot. They had some sniping going on outside Biscari airfield and a bunch of Americans had been hit. When about 40 Italian soldiers surrendered, they couldn't tell which ones had done the sniping, so they lined them all up and shot them. Then a sergeant took about 30 prisons back behind the line. When they got some distance he grabbed a machine gun and let them have it. That got my attention like the whistling shell that had sailed over us. It made you think twice about surrendering yourself if it ever came. In his last speech to the 45th Infantry Division in August 1943, following their combat success in Sicily, at an outdoor address, Patton told the men and officers of the 45th, "Your division is one of the best if not the best division in the history of American arms." By his praise, Patton was reinforcing his faith in his Killer Division. They were doing things the way he wanted their division to do things and the way he had instructed them to do things in prior speeches. At the time he uttered these words to the men of the 45th, two of their comrades were facing courts-martial for murder. Captain John T. Compton had ordered a firing squad to shoot approximately 40 unarmed prisoners of war, two of whom were civilians, following a battle to take Biscari Airfield in Sicily on July 14, 1943. In a separate incident, Sergeant Horace T. West had personally machine-gunned 36 unarmed prisoners of war that same day following that same battle. Patton's personal diary for July 15, 1943, a day after these killings, reads, General Omar Bradley, a most loyal man, arrived in great excitement about 0900 to report that a captain in the 180th Regimental Combat Team, 45th Division, Sheeran's actual regiment within the division, had taken my injunction to kill men who kept on shooting until we got within 200 yards seriously, and had shot some 50 prisoners in cold blood and in ranks, which was an even greater error. I told him that it was probably an exaggeration, but in any case to tell the officer to certify that the dead men were snipers or had attempted to escape or something, as it would make a stink in the press and also would make the civilians mad. General Omar Bradley, Patton's equal in rank, did no such thing. Bradley engaged in no cover-up, and his investigation led to murder charges against the captain and the sergeant. Captain John T. Compton was tried by a military court, but he was acquitted on the grounds that he was merely following Patton's explicit instructions to the 45th to shoot prisoners in cold blood. Sergeant Horace T. West was also tried by a military court for murder, and he used the same defense as Captain Compton. A lieutenant testified for the sergeant that the night before the invasion of Sicily, Lieutenant Colonel William H. Schaefer went on the ship's loudspeaker and reminded the men of Patton's words. They would not take any prisoners. Sergeant Horace T. West, however, was convicted and given life in prison. The unremitting outcry that ensued following the acquittal of an officer and the conviction of an enlisted man for essentially the same course of conduct, on the same day, following the same battle, in the same campaign, from the same 45th Infantry Division, led to the sergeant's prompt release and return to combat, where he served out the balance of the war as a private. 4 months after his acquittal, Captain Compton was shot and killed as he approached German soldiers who were displaying the white flag of surrender as a deadly trick. There were hushed reports of other atrocities in Sicily as well. In his book General Patton, A Soldier's Life, Stanley P. Hirschson cites one well-known British newspaperman of the day who witnessed 2 busloads of about 60 prisoners each being shot, but who chose not to report the story after Patton gave his word he would put a stop to all atrocities. The newspaperman, however, told a friend, and that friend prepared a memorandum that recounted the events. The memo states, Patton's bloodthirsty way of talking, and wording of his instructions, before the landing in Sicily was taken too literally by the American troops of the 45th Division particularly. Later that day, Diggsy asked me about a rumor he had heard from a neighborhood pal he had run into overseas that I had enlisted because Yank knocked a girl up and blamed me. Can you imagine, halfway around the world and rumors are going around about me. I knew. Doing what had to do. The easiest part of the war was Sicily. The Italians were terrible soldiers. The Germans were keeping the backbone in the Italians. We'd advance, and sometimes the Italian soldiers actually would be standing there at attention with their suitcases packed. While I was in Sicily, Mussolini surrendered and the Germans took over the war from the Italians. The Sicilian people were very friendly. Once we drove the Germans out, I got to see Catania, where every house had homemade spaghetti drying on the clothesline. After the war, Russell Buffalino liked the fact that I went right through his town. My first new pal was a tough guy in our squad out of the Jewish section of Brooklyn named Alex Siegel. We had our picture taken together in Sicily with my arm resting on his shoulder, but he got killed a month later in a strafing on the beachhead at Salerno. Salerno is a town just below Naples on the western coast of Italy. In September 1943, We jumped off landing craft into the Mediterranean with German shells exploding all around us. Salerno was the worst of the 3 invasion landings I made. Those of us who made it ashore had the goal of getting about 1,000 yards up to secure the beachhead. Each soldier had a shovel on his pack, and we began digging in. No matter how tired you are, when you hear enemy artillery, you dig with a passion. Our position was pounded by artillery and strafed by German planes. If you saw German soldiers coming at you, you shot your rifle. I know I was there shooting. I know I asked myself why the hell did I volunteer for this, but I have no recollection of the first time I fired at an enemy soldier in Salerno. We almost got pushed off the beach by the Germans. But I know I stayed there the same as everybody else did. Everybody's scared. Some don't want to admit it. But it doesn't make a difference whether you admit it or not, you're still the combat report quotes an on-the-scene general of another division who said, the 45th prevented the Germans from driving the Allied invaders into the sea. When our Navy artillery brought in heavy firepower, the Germans retreated back out of the range of the Navy's guns. That gave us a chance to move up, and we advanced off the beach and hooked up with other divisions for a push north. Riflemen would do whatever we were assigned to do. If you didn't follow an order in combat, they can shoot you automatically, right then. Jimmy Hoffa was never in the service. He got a hardship of some kind to keep out. In combat you learn fast, if you didn't know it already, certain rules are strict rules and nobody's above those rules. Before combat I was never much on following orders myself, but I learned over there to follow orders. Rel Sheeran was there following orders for what the combat report calls the sickness and exhaustion that had developed among the troops, in the fatiguing and heart-breaking fighting over rough terrain, in the drive from Salerno north to Venafro. In unrelenting succession came the suffering attendant to a winter campaign in the cold vastness of the Apennine Mountains under the guns of the German-held monastery at Monte Cassino. We pushed north in Italy from Naples toward Rome, and by November 1943, we got as far as the foothills where we began being shelled by Germans above us on the mountains around Monte Cassino. We were pinned down there for over 2 months. There was a monastery on top of Monte Cassino that the Germans used as an observation post so they could see our every move. It was an ancient monastery, and certain factions didn't want it bombed. When they finally did bomb it, they made the whole situation worse because now the Germans could get protection from the rubble. In January 1944 we tried to assault the German line but got thrown back down the mountain. Some nights we'd go out on patrol to capture a German soldier for interrogation. Most nights we just tried to stay dry from all the rain and keep from getting hit. By then I was learning not to get close to too many people. You get to liking people and you see them get killed. A 19-year-old kid would come in as a replacement, and before his boots got a chance to dry he was dead. It's got to affect you mentally. I was close to Diggsy and that was it. It was tough enough seeing Diggsy get shot twice. Then came the worst of it. They decided to send some of us back to a rest area near Naples and Caserta. It had been the Italian king's palace. We had it easy for about 10 days and then we took off in landing craft for Anzio. This was a coastal town that was north of the German line at Monte Cassino but south of Rome. The idea was to attack the German flank and give our main force a chance to break through at Monte Gas. The 45th Division was pulled back from the repeatedly unsuccessful and costly Allied attacks against the monastery at Monte Cassino to open up another front on the German flank by the amphibious invasion of Anzio. In moving the 45th away from the front line at Monte Cassino, General Mark Clark wrote, "For the past 72 days the 45th Infantry Division has been engaged in continuous combat against strong enemy forces and under extreme combat conditions." General Clark reflected upon the bitter cold, wet and almost constant enemy artillery and mortar fire, to which the 45th Division, and Private Frank Sheeran, had been subjected at Monte Cassino. What the general didn't know was that he was taking the 45th out of the frying pan of Monte Cassino and putting them right into the fire that was the hell of Anzio. Battle or a landing, you get a little nervous tension. Once the shooting starts it goes away. You don't have time to think. You just do what you have to do. After the battle it sinks in. We took the Germans by surprise at the Anzio beach, taking a couple of hundred prisoners. Everything was quiet that first 24 hours as we moved up off the beach, but instead of advancing, the general in charge thought it was a trap. He decided to play it safe and wait for our tanks and artillery to land. This delay in advancing gave the Germans time to get their tanks and artillery into position above us and to dig in so they could pin us down and keep our tanks standing. And artillery from as Sir Winston Churchill put it, and despite his expressed wishes to the contrary, but now came disaster. The defenses of the beachhead were growing, but the opportunity for which great exertions had been made was gone. Hitler poured in reinforcements, pinned the Allies down, and ordered that his army eliminate what he called the abscess of the Allied beachhead at Anzio. Then along came their heavy artillery and their airplanes strafing us. We had to dig deep because foxholes wouldn't do us any good. We ended up in dugouts that went down about 8 feet that we dug with our shovels. We used foot ladders to climb out, and we put boards and tree branches on top to protect us from the rain and to absorb the shrapnel from the constant shelling. We stayed like that under a never-ending attack for 4 solid months. You couldn't leave your dugout during daylight or they'd pick you off. The worst shelling was done at night by what we nicknamed the Anzio Express. It was a giant piece of artillery that the Germans kept camouflaged during the day so our airplanes couldn't find it. It was kept on a railroad track outside of Rome. They'd bring it out and put it into position after dark, when our planes were on the ground, and fire round after round at us. Its incoming shell sounded like a boxcar on a freight train overhead in the night sky. It was so loud and scary it was demoralizing every time you heard it, and you never let yourself think too long that some poor GIs not far from you were on the receiving end of it and getting blown all to hell so there'd be no bodies left even to send home to their families. And you could be next. You took your turn on point 100 yards out on the perimeter as an outpost so the other guys could get some sleep, but there wasn't much sleeping during those 4 months. I've found better places to be than to be out on point all night. Nighttime is always scarier than daytime. Even without the Anzio Express at night you're getting conventional shelling all day long. It rattles your nerves, and you harden up inside to keep from rattling all over. It's got to affect you unless you're a complete nut. Twice the Germans advanced on our position trying to drive us off the beach, but the combat report states that the 45th ripped to shreds the German attempt to erase the beachhead. This period of repelling the German assault was followed by the long months of holding and waiting at Anzio and constant bombardment and loss of more than 6,000 Allied lives. In May the main force that had been at a standoff broke through the German line at Monte Cassino. By the end of that month, 150,000 weary but happy soldiers moved out of their dugouts in Anzio and linked up with the main force advancing from the south toward Rome. Meanwhile, on June 6, the Allies landed in Normandy and opened up another front. We are head into Rome without a fight. Rome was what they called an one open city, which meant neither side would bomb it, but there was a little bombing. Rome is the first time I ever saw a sidewalk cafe. We'd sit there and relax, eat our lunch, and drink a little wine. I saw my first blonde Italian women in Rome parading by the cafes. I had a few adventures. It wasn't hard to do. We were issued chocolate bars and tins of cheese and chopped eggs in a can. That's all it took. The people had nothing so you can't judge them on morals. Fraternizing with the local women was against regulations, but what were they going to do, send us to a combat unit? We fought the Germans in Italy for a while, and then we got put on landing craft for the invasion of southern France called Operation Dragoon on August 14, 1944. We had some resistance as we landed. It was more harassment than real firepower. But fire is fire. 2 shots of fire is still bad. Running up out of the surf onto the beach at St. Tropez I thought I was shot. I looked down and saw red all over my uniform. I hollered for the medic and Lieutenant Kavota from Hazleton, Pennsylvania, came running over to me and shouted, "You son of a bitch, that's wine. You ain't shot. Get up and get going. They shot your canteen." He was a good Joe. We finally drove the Germans back and we entered the Alsace-Lorraine region, which is part French and part German. I had a pal from Kentucky that we called Pope. He was a damn good soldier. You can't say such and such a guy is a coward. You can only absorb so much. In Alsace-Lorraine I saw Pope stick his leg out from behind a tree to get $1 million wound so he'd be sent home, only a heavy round came in and took his leg off. He survived and went home with one leg missing. Another way I saw guys snap a little bit is when it came to taking prisoners. Here these Germans were shooting at you, trying to kill you and blowing your pals all to hell, and now you've got a chance to get them back, and they want to surrender. Some people take that personally. So maybe you didn't understand what they were saying. Or if you did take them alive and you took them back behind your own line, maybe they tried to escape. I don't mean a massacre. If you had a load of prisoners you took them back, but with a handful of Germans or less you did what you had to do and what everybody else expected you to do. The lieutenant gave me a lot of prisoners to handle and I did what I had to do. In a firefight in the Alsace, Diggsy got hit in the back halfway up a hill. The medics got him and started bringing him down the hill. I didn't have much emotion left by this time in the war, but I have to say seeing little Diggsy hit on that hill and I was emotional. I saw his rifle on the ground where he fell. They didn't want you to lose your rifle over there. I must have snapped or something. So I called for cover from the other guys, and I crawled up and got Diggsy's rifle for him. When we all crawled back down the hill, Diggs said to me, "You got to be nuts. You could have been killed for this friggin' M1. I said, the Germans didn't know they had us outnumbered. It was the second time I had seen him get shot. In Alsace-Lorraine we heard that the Germans had launched a desperate counteroffensive up north through a forest in Belgium to halt our advance after Normandy in what they called the Battle of the Bulge. The Germans were advancing in a bulge and so Allied troops were needed to be sent from our southern front to reinforce their northern front. Our company was left to cover the division's whole southern front, which meant 120 men were covering a front that might have been covered by a full division of 10,000 or 15,000 men. All we did was retreat. We walked the whole night New Year's Eve of 1945. We watched the French people of the Alsace pulling in the American flags on their houses and start putting the German flags back up. But soon reinforcements came in, and we built up our strength and pushed back into the German part of the Alsace. From there we fought our way to the Harz Mountains. The Germans occupied the summit. One night we intercepted a mule train with hot food for the Germans on top. We ate what we wanted and soiled the rest with our waste. We left the German women alone. They were like our WACs. They had prepared the food. We just left them there. But the mule teams were driven by a handful of German soldiers. We had no intention of taking them back down the mountain, and we couldn't take them with us as we advanced up, so we gave them shovels, and they dug their own shallow graves. You wonder why would anyone bother to dig their own graves, but then I guess you cling to some hope that maybe the people with the guns would change their mind, or maybe your own people would come along while you were digging, or maybe if you cooperated and dug your own grave you'd get a good clean hit without any brutality or suffering. By this time, I thought nothing of doing what I had to do. From the Harz Mountains we made a right turn and kept on. Heading in a direct line south in Germany, taking Bamberg and then Nuremberg. That town had been practically bombed to the ground. Nuremberg had been the place where Hitler held all his big rallies. Every single symbol of the Nazis that survived the bombing was systematically destroyed. Our goal was Munich in Bavaria in southern Germany, the town where Hitler had gotten his start in a beer hall. But on the way, we made a stop to liberate the concentration camp. At the combat report states that inside the camp there were some 1,000 bodies. Gas chamber and crematoriums were conveniently side by side. Clothing, shoes, and bodies were stacked alike in neat and orderly piles. Heard rumors about atrocities at the camps, but we were not prepared for what we were seeing and for the stench. If you see something like that, it gets printed on your mind forever. That scene and that smell when you first saw it never goes away. The young, blonde-haired German commander in charge of the camp and all his officers were loaded in jeeps and driven off. We heard gunfire in the distance. In short order all of the rest of them, about 500 German soldiers guarding Dachau, were taken care of by us. Some of the camp victims who had the strength borrowed our guns and did what they had to do. And nobody batted an eye when it was done. Right after that we marched down and took Munich, and about 2 weeks later the war in Europe ended with Germany's unconditional surrender. All these years later and from stirring it up I started having dreams again about the combat, only the dreams were all mixed in with things I started doing for certain people after the war. I was discharged on October 24, 1945, a day before my 25th birthday, but only according to the 7AR. Waking up in America by Cockney Idents I ran into my kid brother, Tom, on the dock in Havre, a Grave, France, in October 1945. The war was over and we were both shipping back to Philly, but on separate ships. Tom had seen a little bit of combat. I said, "Hi, Tom." He said, "Hi, Frank. You've changed. You're not the same brother I remember from before the war." I knew just what he meant. That's what 411 days of combat does to you. He could see it on my face, maybe in my stare. Thinking about what my brother said to me on the dock in Havre de Grace makes me wonder if he was looking into my soul. I knew something was different about me. I didn't care anymore about things. I had been through practically the whole war. What could anybody do to me? Somewhere overseas I had tightened up inside, and I never loosened up again. You get used to death. You get used to killing. Sure, you go out and have fun, but even that has an edge. Not to bellyache or anything, because I was one of the lucky ones to come out in one piece. But if I hadn't volunteered for action I never would have seen any of what I saw or did any of what I had to do. I would have stayed in the States as an MP jitterbugging to Tuxedo Junction. You step on shore from overseas and everywhere you look you see Americans, and they are not wearing a uniform, and they're speaking English, and you get a big boost in morale. The Army gives you $100 a month for 3 months. The men who didn't go seem to have all the good jobs and you just go back to where you came from and try to pick up where you left off. I went back to live with my parents in West Philly and back to Pearlstein's to pick up where I left off as an apprentice. But I couldn't handle being cooped up in a job after living outdoors all that time overseas. The Pearlstein, less than 53 greater than. Family was good to me, but I couldn't take supervision and I quit after a couple of months. Many a morning I found myself waking up in America and being surprised to find myself in a bed. I had been having nightmares all night long, and I didn't know where I was. It would take me a while to adjust, because I couldn't believe I was in a bed. What was I doing in a bed? After the war one never slept more than 3 or 4 hours a night. In those days you didn't talk about stuff like that. There was no such thing as war syndrome, but you knew something was different. You tried not to remember anything from over there, but things came back to you. You had done every damn thing overseas, from killing in cold blood to destroying property to stealing whatever you wanted and to drinking as much wine and having as many women as you wanted. You lived every minute of every day in danger of your own life and limb. You couldn't take chances. Many times you had a split second to decide to be judge, jury, and executioner. You had just 2 rules you had to obey. You had to be back in your outfit when you went back on the line. You had to obey a direct order in combat. Break one of those rules and you could be executed yourself, right on the spot even. Otherwise, you flaunted authority. You lost the moral skill you had built up in civilian life, and you replaced it with your own rules. You developed a hard covering, like being encased in lead. You were scared more than you'd ever been in your life. You did certain things, maybe against your will sometimes, but you did them, and if you stayed over there long enough you didn't even think about them anymore. You did them like you might scratch your head if it itched. You had seen the damnedest things. Emaciated bodies stacked up like logs in a concentration camp, young kids barely shaving and lying about their ages to get into combat and then getting blown away, even your own buddies lying down dead in the mud. Imagine how you feel when you see only one body laid out in a funeral parlor. There you're seeing body after body. I used to think a lot about dying when I got home. Everybody does. Then I thought, what are you worrying about? You have no control over it. I figured everybody is put here with 2 dates already determined for them. A date for when they're born and a date for when they go. You don't have any control over either one of those dates, so, what will be, became my motto. I got through the war, so what can happen to me? I didn't care so much anymore about things. What will be will be. I did a lot of wine drinking overseas. I used the wine over there the way the Jeeps used gasoline. And I kept it up when I got back home. Both of my wives complained about my drinking. I often said that when they put me in jail in 1981 it was not the FBI's intent, but they saved my life. They only have 7 days in a week, and by the time I went to jail I was drinking 8. That first year home I tried different jobs. I worked for Bennett Coal and Ice whenever they needed me. I hauled ice in the summer, 2 cakes in the icebox. Lots of people didn't have electric refrigerators after the war. In the winter I delivered coal for heating. It was funny that my first job at 7 was cleaning out the ashes that the coal leaves behind, and now I had made it all the way up to delivering the coal. I worked for a moving company for a month. I stacked cement bags at a cement plant all day long. I worked on construction as a laborer. Whatever I could get. I didn't rob a bank. I was a bouncer and taught ballroom dancing at Wagner's Dance Hall part-time on Tuesday, Friday, and Saturday nights. I kept that job for about 10 years. I had too many jobs to remember. One job I do remember was taking hot blueberry pie mix coming out of a cooker onto an ice-cold aluminum conveyor. The more I raked, the cooler the blueberries got before they went into the Tastykake pies. The job pusher kept on me to rake harder. He said, "You're a little lax on that rake." I tried to ignore him, and he said, "You hear what I said, boy?" I asked him who the hell did he think he was talking to. He said, "I'm talking to you, boy." He said that if I didn't put more effort into the job he'd stick the rake up my butt. I told him I'd do him one better and stick the rake down his throat. He was a big black guy, and he came at me. I tapped him and put him on the conveyor belt unconscious. I stuffed blueberries in his mouth. That took care of him. The cops had to take me out of there. After that my mother went over to see a state senator named Jimmy Judge. My mother had some political connections. One of her brothers was a doctor in Philly. Another one was big in the glass union and was a freeholder, which is like a councilman, in Camden. He's the one who got me the union apprenticeship at Pearlstein's. Anyway, one morning when I woke up she told me she had arranged with the senator to get me on the Pennsylvania State Police. All I had to do was pass the physical. I wanted to be grateful, but that was the last thing I wanted to do, so I never went down to pay my respects to the senator. Years later when I told my lawyer, F. Emmett Fitzpatrick, that one he said, "What a cop you'd have made." I said, "Yeah, a rich one. Rape, child abuse, things like that, D have arrested you for anything else and you'd have been on your way with an out-of-court settlement." I tried to be easygoing again like I was before I went in the war, but I couldn't get the hang of it. It didn't take much to provoke me. I'd just flare up. Drinking helped ease that a little. I hung around with my old crew. Football helped a little, too. I played tackle and guard for Shanahan's. My old pal Yank Quinn was the quarterback. They had leather football helmets in those days, but with my oversized head I couldn't get comfortable in one. So I played with a woolen cap on my head, not for bravado or anything, but it's the only thing I could get to fit my big head. There's no doubt if I was born later on in better times I would have loved to try out to be a professional football player. I wasn't just big. I was very strong, very fast, very agile, and a smart player. All my teammates but one are gone now. Like I said, we're all terminal, we just don't know the date. Like all young people we thought we had forever to live back then. One afternoon a bunch of us went downtown to sell our blood for $10 a pint to get some more money to keep drinking shots and beer. On the way back we saw a sign for a carnival. It said that if you could last 3 rounds with a kangaroo you'd win $100. That was a better deal than the blood money we had just made. So off we went to the carnival. They had a trained kangaroo in the ring with boxing gloves on. My pals put me up to fight the kangaroo. Now a kangaroo has short arms, so I'm figuring I'll knock his ass out. They put gloves on me and I start jabbing away at him, but what I didn't know is that a kangaroo has a loose jaw, so when you hit them it doesn't go to their brain and knock them out. I'm only jabbing at him, because who wants to hurt a kangaroo? But when I couldn't get anywhere with him with my jab, I let loose with an overhand right, a real haymaker. Down the kangaroo goes and I feel this hard whack on the back of my head where my old man used to whack me. I shake it off and go back to jabbing. Waking up in America, the kangaroo who's hopping all over the place, and I'm trying to figure out who the SOB was who clipped me from behind. You see, another thing I didn't know is that the kangaroo defends itself with its tail. It has an 8-foot tail that comes whipping up behind you when you knock the kangaroo down. And the harder I hit him, the harder and faster his tail came up behind me. I never saw that tail come whipping up behind me, and I never paid attention to the boxing glove on the tail. He had an 8-foot reach I didn't know about. Actually, my attention was on a pretty Irish girl sitting in the stands with the sweetest smile on her face. I was trying to show off for her. Her name was Mary Letty, and I had seen her in the neighborhood, but I had never spoken to her. Pretty soon she was going to change her name to Mrs. Frances J. Sheeran, but she didn't know that then sitting there in the third row, laughing along with the rest of the crowd. Between the first 2 rounds my buddies are laughing like hell, but I don't know what's going on. I came out for the second round, and it was more of the same, only this time I knocked the kangaroo down twice, which isn't easy to begin with, and I got hit on the back of the head twice. I was starting to get groggy from drinking all day, selling my blood, and getting whacked on the back of the head. I wasn't looking too good to the girl in the third row, either. Between the second and third rounds I asked my buddies what the hell was going on. Who's hitting me on the head? They told me it's the referee, that he doesn't like Irishmen. I walked over and told the referee if he hits me on the back of the head one more time I'm going to knock him out. He said, "Get back in there and fight, rookie." I came out now with one eye on the kangaroo and one eye on the referee. I'm really steaming mad now, and I creamed that kangaroo. His tail hit me so hard my head ached for 3 days. I jumped off at the referee and decked him. The referee's people jumped in the ring after me, and my pals jumped in after them. The cops had a hell of a time in that ring sorting things out. I got taken down to Moco, which was our name for the city jail at 10th and Moyamensing. In those days they'd keep you informally for a while and let you go without any legal proceedings. They didn't work you over or anything, unless you asked for it. They picked their shots. When they thought I had enough punishment they released me. I headed straight for Mary Letty's house, knocked on her door, and asked her out. We made a date to go see Erskine Hawkins's big band at the Earl Theatre. We had a ball. She was a real strict Catholic, and I was very respectful. She had beautiful dark brown hair and the prettiest Irish face I had ever seen. And boy could she dance. I had in my mind that night that this was the girl I was going to marry. I wanted to settle down. I had done enough roaming. I meant well. They say good girls like bad boys. Opposites attract. Mary loved me, but her family hated me. They thought I was what they used to call shanty Irish, and I guess they thought they were what they used to call lace curtain Irish. Or maybe they saw something in me, that as hard as I was trying I was still too unpredictable for their Mary. Mary went to church every Sunday, and I went with her. I did try hard. In 1947 we got married at Mother of Sorrows Church, where I had gotten bounced as an altar boy for drinking the wine. I was still without a steady job, picking up work where I could, and working at Wagner's. I went around to 4 finance companies and borrowed $100 from each one so we could get married. Then when the collectors came around I persuaded them that they couldn't find me. One of them that I convinced had my case taken over by his supervisor, who decided not to cooperate with my disappearance and showed up one night at Wagner's looking for Frank Sheeran. He didn't know it was me at the door. I said to follow me and I'd take him in to see Mr. Sheeran. He followed me into the bathroom and I gave him a shot to the body and a shot to the jaw and down he went. I didn't give him the boot or anything. I just wanted to make sure he understood that Mr. Sheeran was too busy to see him that night or any other night. He got the message. Mary had a good job with the Philadelphia College of Pharmacy as a secretary. We couldn't afford our own place in the beginning, and so like most of our friends we lived with her parents to start off our married life. I wouldn't advise that to anyone who could help it. The night of the wedding we had a reception at her parents' house, and I had a few drinks in me and I announced that I was going to return all the wedding gifts to her side of the family. If they didn't want me I didn't want their gifts. I wouldn't advise that either. I still had that hair trigger from the war. According to my rap sheet, my first real legal proceeding was on February 4, 1947. Two big stiffs on a trolley must have said something I didn't like, or maybe they looked at me the wrong way. It didn't take much in those days. The three of us got off the trolley to fight. I was beating the both of them when the cops pulled up and told us to get going. The two stiffs were happy to get off the corner. I told the cop I wasn't going anywhere until I was finished with them. Next thing you know I'm fighting three cops. This time they booked me for disorderly conduct and resisting arrest. I had a pocketknife in my pocket. So to keep the bail high they threw in a charge for a concealed weapon. If I was ever going to use a weapon it wouldn't be a pocketknife. I paid a fine, and they put me on probation. We saved our money and didn't stay too long with the Latis, and I kept looking for work I could stay with. I worked at Bud Manufacturing where they made auto body parts. It was a slave pit, a real butcher shop. They had no decent safety standards. Every so often somebody would lose a hand or a finger. People today forget how much good the unions did in getting decent working conditions. I didn't feel like donating an arm to Bud, so that's another place I quit, but that job made an impression on me when I got into union work later. In desperation for a job, I went walking down Girard Avenue among the real butcher companies. I saw a black guy lugging hindquarters and loading them onto a truck for Swift's Meat Company. I asked him about work, and he sent me to a guy and the guy asked me if I thought I could handle loading hindquarters. 3 days a week I was going to the gym and hitting the heavy bag, the speed bag, lifting weights, and playing handball. Plus I was teaching dancing, so I picked up a hindquarter like it was a pork chop, and I got the job. The black guy was Buddy Hawkins and we became friends. Every morning for breakfast Buddy had a triple shot of Old Grand-Dad and a double piece of French apple pie. Buddy introduced me to Dusty Wilkinson, a black heavyweight who once fought the champ Jersey Joe Walcott. He gave Walcott a hell of a fight. Dusty was good people and we became friends. He was a good fighter, but he didn't like to train. He worked as a bouncer at a black dance club called the Nixon Ballroom and at a bar, the Red Rooster, at 10th and Wallace. I'd stop in and hang out with Dusty at the bar and drink for free. With a steady paycheck coming in and a baby on the way, Mary was able to give notice at her job, and we were able to afford our own place to live in. We rented a house in Upper Darby. We paid half the rent in exchange for Mary taking care of the landlady's daughter during the day. And then we had our first baby girl, Mary Ann, born on Mary's birthday. There's no greater feeling than that. I made a vow to make as much money as I could for my family. Being Catholic, we were going to have as many children as God provided to us. We had a nice christening for Mary Ann at the house. Dusty came to the house, which was a little unusual in 1948 in Philadelphia. The Phillies were the last major league team to get a black player. After loading trucks for a while, I finally got a good steady union job as a truck driver with food fare. I kept that job for 10 years. I delivered hindquarters and chickens mostly. Dusty showed me how to make a little extra on the side. I'd set aside some chickens and replace them with ice so the weight of the crates remained the same. I'd drive by the Red Rooster bar, and Dusty would have the people lined up to buy their chickens. He'd sell whole, fresh killed chickens for $1 a piece, and we'd split the money down the middle. If I had 60 extra chickens, that was $30 a piece. My daughter Peggy was born a little over a year later, and with the steady work at food fare, the extra job at Wagner's, and the money from the chickens, things were looking prosperous around the Sheeran household. Mary's mother helped out with the 2 babies. Then I switched over a couple of nights from Wagner's dance hall to the Nixon Ballroom as a bouncer with Dusty. The black girls would hit on me to make their boyfriends jealous, and I'd have to settle everybody down. One day Dusty came up with an idea. He told me that the men were beginning to think I was afraid to fight them because I would only settle them down. So we worked out a deal where I would back down and keep backing down while Dusty made bets that I would kick a guy's ass. When the bets were in, Dusty would nod his head and I'd knock the guy out. I don't know if you've ever knocked anybody out, but the best place to hit them is where the jaw meets the ear. If you catch them right, they fall forward. They were always grabbing at my shirt on the way down and ripping it, so I had a deal with Nixon that I got a new white shirt every night as part of my pay. Anyway, Dusty and I would split the profit on the bets. Unfortunately, that didn't last too long. Pretty soon there were no volunteers. We had our third daughter in 1955, Dolores. Mary and I went to church every Sunday, and the children had their own mass. Mary went to novenas when they had them and made all the sacraments. Mary was a terrific mother. She was a very quiet girl like my mother, but she showed our girls affection. That was hard for me to do, because I never got it as a kid. I learned how more with my grandchildren than with my own children. Mary did the raising of the girls. All my daughters never gave me a headache on their behavior. Not due to my care. Due to their mother's attention and the way she raised them. I used to take my second daughter, Peggy, to Johnny Monk's club with me. Mary Ann liked to stay at home with her mother and the new baby, Dolores. Johnny Monk was the ward leader. His joint had very good food. We'd go there for New Year's Eve, even though Mary was no drinker. Mary liked to arrange picnics with the kids, and we'd take them to the Willow Grove amusement park. I wasn't always running. When they were smaller, I used to take them out. I was very close to Peggy, but she doesn't talk to me anymore, not since Jimmy disappeared. The whole thing changed when I started hanging around downtown. Some of the drivers at Food Fair were Italian, and I started going downtown with them to the bars and restaurants that certain people also hung out in. I got into another culture. I feel very bad about it now. I wasn't an abusive father, but I started getting a little neglectful, and Mary was too good a woman, too easy on me. Then at some point, I just joined that other culture and I stopped coming home. But I brought cash over every single week. If I did good, Mary did good. I was a selfish bastard. I thought I was doing good by giving money, but I didn't give the kids enough family time. I didn't give my wife enough time. It was different in the 60s when I married my second wife, Irene, and I had my fourth daughter, Connie. By then I was with Hoffa and the Teamsters, and I had steady money coming in and I was older and home more. I wasn't out maneuvering. I was already in position. Sometime in the 50s I remember seeing On the Waterfront in the movies with Mary and thinking that I'm at least as bad as that Marlon Brando character and that someday I'd like to get in union work. The Teamsters gave me good job security at Food Fair. They could only fire you if they caught you stealing. Let me put it another way. They could only fire you if they caught you stealing, and they could. Russell Buffalino. In 1957 the mob came out of the closet. It came out unwillingly, but out it came. Before 1957 reasonable men could differ over whether an organized network of gangsters existed in America. For years FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover had assured America that no such organization existed, and he deployed the FBI's greatest resources to investigate suspected communists. But as a result of the publicity foisted on the mob in 1957, even Hoover came on board. The organization was dubbed La Cosa Nostra, meaning, this thing of ours, a term heard on government wiretaps. Ironically, the publicity-shy Russell Buffalino had something to do with the mob's unwanted publicity in 1957. Russell Buffalino helped organize the famous meeting of godfathers from around the nation at the town of Apalachin, New York, in November 1957. The meeting had been called to settle down the potential problems that could have erupted in the wake of the October 1957 shooting of Godfather Albert Anastasia in a barber's chair with a hot towel over his face in New York's Park Sheraton Hotel. The Apalachin meeting did the mob much more harm than good. The police in Apalachin were suspicious of all the mob activity in the area and raided the house in which the meeting was being held. This was before the U.S. Supreme Court changed all the laws on search and seizure. 58 of the most powerful mobsters in America were seized and hauled in by the police. Another 50 or so got away running through the woods. Also in 1957 the public was getting a close look at organized crime on TV every day during the televised sessions of the McClellan Committee hearings on organized crime of the United States Senate. Live for all America to see in black and white as no newspaper could convey. It were tough mobsters wearing diamond pinky rings conferring quietly with their mob lawyers, then shifting in their chairs to face the senators and their counsel, Bobby Kennedy, and in gruff voices taking the Fifth Amendment as to every single question. Most of these questions were loaded with accusations of murder, torture, and other major criminal activity. The litany became a part of the culture of the 50s. Senator, on advice of counsel, I respectfully decline to answer that question on the grounds that it might tend to incriminate me. And, of course, the public took that answer as an admiss. Scion of guilt. No major decision of the Commission of La Cosa Nostra was made without Russell Buffalino's approval. Yet the public knew nothing of him before Appolition and the McClellan Committee hearings. Unlike the Al Capones or the dapper Don types who flaunt their status, the quiet Buffalino could have been mistaken for a typical Italian immigrant. Born Rosario Buffalino in 1903 in Sicily, in the years following Appolition and the McClellan hearings the Justice Department almost succeeded in having Buffalino deported, along with his close friend and ally Carlos Marcello, crime boss of New Orleans. With his plane tickets already purchased and arrangements made to take some of his money with him, Buffalino succeeded in beating his deportation charges in court. Not wanting to take their chances in court with Carlos Marcello, the FBI literally picked Russell's good friend Carlos up off the streets of New Orleans and put him on a plane to Guatemala. Carlos had a Guatemalan birth certificate, and according to the FBI he had no rights of an American citizen. Fuming and enraged, Marcello flew back and also beat his deportation charges in court. Despite the government pressure, Buffalino continued to conduct his business and flourish. The Pennsylvania Organized Crime Commission's 1980 report, A Decade of Organized Crime, revealed that by that time, there are no more Magadino or Genovese crime families. The members in these families are now under the control of Russell Buffalino. Buffalino was identified by the Pennsylvania Organized Crime Commission as a silent partner of the largest supplier of ammunition to the untied state's government, Medico Industries. Russell Buffalino. Russell Buffalino 65 had secret interests in Las Vegas casinos and not-so-secret connections to the Cuban dictator Fulgencio Batista, whom Fidel Castro toppled in 1959. With Batista's blessings, Buffalino had owned a racetrack and a major casino near Havana. Buffalino lost a great deal of money and property, including the racetrack and the casino, when Castro booted the mob off the island. Time magazine reported in June 1975, a week before the assassination of Sam Momo Giancana in Chicago and a month before the disappearance of Jimmy Hoffa in Detroit, and during the time of the Church Committee Senate hearings on the CIA's ties to organized crime, that Russell Buffalino's help had been successfully recruited by the CIA in a mysterious CIA gangland plot to kill Castro. Senator Frank Church's committee concluded that Buffalino was part of a bizarre conspiracy to assassinate Castro with poison pills just before the April 1961 Bay of Pigs invasion was to take place. Buffalino had 3 acquittals for organized crime activity in the 70s. The last, a federal extortion case, came down a mere 5 days prior to Jimmy Hoffa's disappearance. The Buffalo Evening News reported on July 25, 1975, "It turned out the way I anticipated," said Buffalino, who has been linked to the CIA's plotting of the Bay of Pigs invasion. That same day the Rochester, New York, Democrat and Chronicle reported, when asked if he will retire, Buffalino said, "TD like to retire, but they won't let me retire. They got to pay my lawyers." Russell Buffalino's organized crime territory included Pennsylvania outside of Philadelphia, upstate New York including Buffalo, and interests in Florida and Canada, parts of New York City, and parts of northern New Jersey. But his true power was in the respect he got from every mob family in the country. In addition, his wife, Carolina Chandra, known as Carey, was related to the Chandra line of La Cosa Nostra. Although no Chandra ever rose to godfather status, members of the family went back to the earliest days of the American Mafia. Perhaps Buffalino's closest friend was Philadelphia crime boss Angelo Bruno. Law enforcement referred to Buffalino as the Quiet Don Rosario. Bruno was known as the Docile Don for his similar low-key approach to heading a major crime family. Like Buffalino's family, the Bruno crime family was not permitted to deal in drugs. Because of his perceived old-fashioned ways, Bruno was killed by greedy underlings in 1980. Bruno's demise would lead to everlasting anarchy in his family. His successor, Philip, Chicken Man, Testa, was literally blown up a year after taking over. Testa's successor, Nicodemus, Little Nicky, Scarfo, is now serving multiple life sentences for murder, having been betrayed by his own underboss and nephew. Little Nicky's successor, John Stanfa, is serving 5 consecutive life sentences for murder. Frank Sheeran got a Christmas card every year from John Stanfa in his Leavenworth cell. John Stanfa's successor, Ralph Natali, is the first boss to turn government informant and testify against his own men. Frank Sheeran calls Philadelphia the city of rats. On the other hand, Russell Buffalino lived a long life. He died of old age in a nursing home in 1994 at the age of 90. He controlled his family until the day he died, and unlike Angelo Bruno's Philadelphia family, not a sign of discord has been reported in the Buffalino family since his death. Frank Sheeran said that of all the alleged crime bosses he ever met, the mannerisms and style of the Marlon Brando portrayal in The Godfather most nearly resembled Russell Buffalino. In a report of its findings, the McClellan Committee on Organized Crime of the United States Senate called Russell Buffalino one of the most ruthless and powerful leaders of the Mafia in the United States. Yet in the summer of 1999 I picked up a man, his wife, and his son along an interstate in upstate Pennsylvania. Their car had broken down, and they needed to get to a rest area. The man turned out to be the retired chief of police of the town where Russell Buffalino had lived and where his widow Carey still lived. I identified myself as a former prosecutor and asked if the man could tell me anything about Russell Buffalino. The retired police chief smiled and told me that, whatever he did in other places he kept it out of our jurisdiction. He was old school, very polite, a perfect gentleman. You wouldn't know he had 2 dimes to rub together from looking at his house or the car he drove. Prosciutto bread and homemade wine. Re-met Russell Buffalino changed my life. And later on, just being seen in his company by certain people turned out to save my life in a particular matter where my life was most definitely on the line. For better or for worse, meeting Russell Buffalino and being seen in his company put me deeper into the downtown culture than I ever would have gotten on my own. After the war, meeting Russell was the biggest thing that happened to me after my marriage and having my daughters. I was hauling meat for food fair in a refrigerator truck in the mid-50s, maybe 1955. Syracuse was my destination when my engine started acting up in Endicott, New York. I pulled into a truck stop and I had the hood up when this short old Italian guy walked up to my truck and said, "Can I give you a hand, kiddo?" I said sure and he keyed around for a while, I think with the carburetor. He had his own tools. I spoke a little Italian to him while he was working. Whatever it was, he got my horse started for me. When the engine started purring, I climbed down and I shook his hand and thanked him. He had a lot of strength in his handshake. The way we shook hands, warmly, you could tell that we both hit it off with each other. Later on when we got to know each other he told me that the first time he saw me he liked the way I carried myself. I told him that there was something special about him, too, like maybe he owned the truck stop or something, or maybe he owned the whole road, but it was more than that. Russell had the confidence of a champ or a winner while still being humble and respectful. When you went to church for confession on Saturday you knew which priest's line to get on. You wanted to go to the fairest one that didn't give you a hard time, he was like that priest. At the time we shook hands that first time I ever laid, less than 6 greater than eyes on him I had no idea who he was or that I would ever see him again. But change my life he did. Around that same time I had already started going downtown to the bocce club at 5th and Washington with a bunch of Italian guys I worked with at Food Fair who lived in South Philly. It was a new crowd for me. From there we'd go over to the Friendly Lounge at 10th and Washington, owned by a guy named John who went by the nickname of Skinny Razor. At first I didn't know anything about John, but some of the guys from Food Fair pushed a little money on their routes for John. A waitress, say, at a diner would borrow $100 and pay back $12 a week for 10 weeks. If she couldn't afford the $12 one week she'd just pay $2, but she'd still owe the $12 for that week and it would get added on at the end. If it wasn't paid on time the interest would keep piling up. The $2 part of the debt was called the vig, which is short for vigorish. It was the juice. My Italian Food Fair buddies made a few bucks that way, and one time when we were at the Friendly Lounge they introduced me to Skinny Razor, and I got started doing it on my route. It was easy money, no muscle, strictly providing a service for people who had no credit. This was before credit cards when the people had nowhere to go for a couple of bucks between paychecks. But technically, pushing money was all illegal since it was the alleged crime of loan sharking. Pushing money was a natural for me, because I was already pushing football lottery tickets in the White Tower hamburger joints on my route for an Irish muscle guy and ex-boxer named Joey McGreal, who was a Teamster organizer out of my local 107. My Italian pals at Food Fair bought lottery tickets from me. I wasn't backing the lottery. I couldn't afford to do that in case somebody hit big. McGreal was backing the thing, and I took my cut on commission. I played the lottery tickets myself. Soon I began selling them downtown to people in the bars. The real bookmakers like Skinny Razor didn't care if I sold them right in the bar, because they didn't mess with football lotteries. It was small stuff. Even so, they were illegal in those days, I guess they still are. You could tell Skinny Razor was successful with his side businesses of bookmaking and loan sharking from the way he conducted his business and the kind of respect he got from people who came in to talk to him. He looked like he was an officer or something and every body else was an enlisted man. But none of my Italian friends identified him as any kind of a gangster big shot or anything like that. What kind of a big shot has the nickname of Skinny Razor? John got the name Skinny Razor because he used to own a live chicken store and the Italian ladies would come and pick out a chicken they wanted from looking at the chickens in the cages all lined up. Then John would take out a straight razor and cut the chicken's throat, and that was the chicken the Italian ladies would take home and pluck and cook for dinner. Skinny Razor was very well liked and he had a great sense of humor. He called everybody mother, in an affectionate way, not like they use that term today. He was very lean and went about 6 feet 1 inch, which was very tall for downtown. He looked a little like a skinny straight razor. Skinny was very good for the underdog. If you made a mistake you could always cop a plea with him, unless what you did was severe. If it was a misdemeanor he'd give you a break, but he wasn't going to adopt you. As hard as it is to believe today, people didn't really know that there was a mob organization in those days. We heard about individual gangsters, sure, like Al Capone with their own gang, but a national mafia with a hand in just about everything, not too many people knew about that. I was in the know about a lot of things, but I didn't know about that even a little bit. Like everybody else, I didn't know that the neighborhood bookie was tied in with the cat burglar jewel thief or the hijacker of trucks or the labor boss or the politician. Didn't know there was this big thing I was getting exposed to little by little in the beginning, when I was getting exposed to their culture. In a way it was like a dock worker being exposed to asbestos every day and not knowing how dangerous it is. They didn't want people to know. The Italian guys I worked with at Food Fair who pushed money for him didn't even know how big the guy was that they called Skinny Razor. Shooting the breeze over a bottle of homemade red wine, I bragged to my Food Fair buddies about the deal I had going with Dusty on the chickens and they put me wise to more money that could be made. After your truck was loaded with hindquarters the yard manager where you loaded your truck would put an aluminum seal on the lock and off you'd go. When you got to the Food Fair store with your delivery of hindquarters the store manager would break the aluminum seal and you'd load the meat into the store's refrigerator. Once the seal was broken, it could never be put back together again, so you couldn't break the seal on your way to the store with the meat delivery. Only the store manager could break the seal. But on cold, bitter days, the yard manager who was supposed to put the seal on after the meat was loaded onto your truck would get a little lazy and hand you the seal to put on for him. Your truck would get a little lazy and hand you the seal to put on for him. If you palmed the seal, you could deliver, say, 5 hindquarters to a guy waiting for it at a diner. He'd deliver it to restaurants and split the money with you. After you gave this guy at the diner his 5 hindquarters, you'd put the seal on your lock. When you got to the store, your seal would be intact and would then be broken by the store manager and everything would be copacetic. Then you'd be a nice guy and tell the butcher you were going to pack the meat for him in his icebox. You'd go in and there'd be hindquarters on hooks on the right rail. You'd take 5 off and put them on the left rail. Then instead of delivering 25 hindquarters, you'd add the 20 you had left to the 5 you already had put on the left rail. The store manager would count your 25 and sign off on it. At inventory, they'd see that they had a shortage, but they wouldn't know who was responsible or how it happened. The yard manager would never admit he handed you the seal to put on yourself and that he was too lazy to go out in the cold and do his job the right way. That's how it worked in theory, but in reality nearly everybody was in on the deal and got a little piece of the pie for looking the other way. Before the war, one earned everything I ever had. During the war, you learned to take whatever you want, whatever you could get away with taking, not that there was much over there worth taking. Still, you took wine and women, and if you needed a car you took it, too, stuff like that. After the war, it just seemed natural to take what you could take wherever you could take it. There was only so much blood you could sell for $10 a pint. I got a little carried away one day and sold my entire load of meat on my way to a delivery in Atlantic City. I put the seal on my lock after the whole load of meat was transferred to the guy. When I got to Atlantic City, the seal was broken by the manager and there was no meat inside, and I was mystified. Maybe the guys who loaded the truck forgot to load it. The store manager asked me, didn't I realize I was driving a light truck? I said I thought I had a good horse. After that incident, Food Fair put signs up in the stores for all managers to keep a sharp eye on me. But then, like I said, a lot of them were in on the thing anyway. The signs didn't stop me. They knew things were missing wherever I went, but they had no proof against me. They knew I was doing it, but they didn't know how I was doing it. And under the contract, management couldn't fire a teamster unless they had certain grounds. They had none. Stealing was grounds only if they could prove it. Besides, I worked hard for them when I wasn't stealing from them. But on November 5, 1956, they decided to take a shot with what they had, and they got me indicted for stealing in interstate commerce. My lawyer wanted me to take a plea and turn on the people who were in it with me. But I knew that all the people in it with me were the witnesses the government planned on using in their case against me. If they put me in jail, they'd have to bring a wagon to court to cart away their own witnesses. If they had me, they had everybody. All they wanted me to do was name names and they'd let me go. I put the word out to the witnesses against me to be stand up, that I wasn't going to rat anybody out. They should keep their mouths shut and act like they don't know anything. Meanwhile, I took the opportunity to break into the office and swipe the records about all the things Food Fair could not account for besides the meat I delivered. The government witnesses, one after another, couldn't pin anything on me. I got my lawyer to put in the Food Fair records about all the things they had missing all the time, all the shortages. The government objected because they said I swiped the records. I said some anonymous guy swiped it and left it in my mailbox. The judge threw the case out and said that if he owned stock in Food Fair he would sell it. Food Fair then made an offer to me through my lawyer that if I would resign they would give me $25,000. I told them I couldn't afford the cut in pay. We celebrated downtown, and I could see that Skinny Razor and some of the other people he sat with were most impressed that I didn't rat anybody out. Not ratting was more important to them than winning the case. Somewhere in that time period when I started hanging out downtown, we went into the Villa de Roma on 9th Street for dinner. One night I spotted this guy and I recognized him as the old guy who got my